Timeless Assassin by Raj_Shah_7152. Chapter 821 to 840. Chapter 821 Destruction. Sector 11 Military Base, Planet Nemo, Leo's POV. BOOOOM. Ka Thrum. Another destroyer split apart in the sky as Leo's blade light carved straight through its reactor, the vessel blooming into a violent flower of fire and twisted metal as burning fragments rained down over the already ruined base, feeding the inferno that was quietly consuming everything below. That makes, what, 12? Leo murmured lazily, counting half in his head as another ship began to list helplessly, its engines failing while alarms flared across its hull. He did not bother finishing the thought, as his wrist flicked again, sending another sharp arc of dagger light slicing through the air toward yet another battleship that had been foolish enough to hover within his strike range. Shing. CRRRRK. BOOOOM. The hit severed the engine ring from its main body, as the ship tilted sideways and began its death spiral, the screams of thousands trapped within swallowed by the roaring flames and distant thunder. Keep coming, Leo said quietly, his gray eyes narrowing as he searched for his next target, his aura held suppressed for now, so that he could unfold it when the ground assault eventually began. Meanwhile, aboard a destroyer ship, a Righteous Legion commander's POV. From the deck of a mid-range destroyer still several kilometers out, a Legion commander watched the battle unfold with a clenched jaw, as ship after ship fell apart in the distance, ripped open by a single Transcendence-ranged attacks. This is insane, he muttered, his knuckles whitening as another explosion lit the horizon, marking yet one more destroyed vessel from their side. Sir, should we increase firing frequency? One of his officers asked, voice tight, as the tactical screen flickered with red markers disappearing at an alarming rate. Increase firing frequency on what? The commander snapped, eyes flashing in irritation and raw fear. The targeting systems cannot even keep up with his movements. At this rate, we are only wasting ammunition and giving him bigger targets to destroy. He stared hard at the shifting image of Leo on the display, watching the small figure weave effortlessly between bombardments, as if the entire onslaught were little more than a training exercise to him. He is too small for the ships to target accurately. These vessels are made to destroy cities, not individuals, the commander muttered, more to himself than anyone else, as a decision solidified in his mind. Signal the rear formations. All carriers and destroyers behind the first line are to land and deploy troops on the surface, he ordered abruptly, his voice turning sharp. We will swarm him from all directions on foot. If we force him to stay grounded, numbers will crush him eventually. He ordered, as the troops obeyed immediately. Meanwhile, Leo watched with mild curiosity as several ships began to break away from bombardment formation, their cannons ceasing fire as they lowered altitude, boarding ramps opening in preparation for deployment. Finally, he said, a faint smirk tugging at his lips as he slowed and turned his attention fully toward the ground. Rows of dropships descended from the larger vessels, slamming into the fields surrounding the base, as hundreds of thousands of soldiers poured out in organized squads, their lines stretching as far as the eye could see, banners fluttering as officers barked commands. The sky, which had been filled with warships, slowly transitioned into a storm of descending troops, as entire battalions formed encirclements around his position, their auras flaring as they prepared for a combined strike. Much better, Leo murmured. This will be the real test of where my limits currently lie. He said, as he began scanning the enemy troops' movements. THRUMM. Step step step. The ground trembled as wave after wave of troops arrived, masters and grandmasters lining up at the front, Transcendence further back coordinating battalion formations, while artillery arrays were deployed behind them, charging in layered formations. Soon, the open space around Sector 11 looked less like a base and more like a sea of metal and flesh, as hundreds of thousands of soldiers tightened their encirclement around Leo with each passing moment. Shadow Dragon. A Transcendent shouted through an amplified vocal technique. You are surrounded. Lay down your weapons and surrender. Your execution is already guaranteed, but we may consider granting you a cleaner death if you cooperate. He threatened, as Leo tilted his head slightly, absorbing the absurdity of the offer as a soft chuckle escaped his lips. No wonder that brain-dead Yuzu is your commander, Leo replied. Calmly, his voice carrying clearly through the charged air. I was wondering how someone as low IQ as him ever made the rank. Of commander, but looking at you now, I finally understand how. So in the end, Yuzu is a half-blind king in a kingdom of blind men. He mocked, before finally unleashing his aura. FWOOM. The moment his aura unfolded, the world seemed to change texture. Weight crushed down upon the battlefield in an instant, an invisible mountain dropping from the sky and pressing itself over every living thing present, as air thickened into something almost solid, forcing its way into lungs that no longer wished to expand. Choke. Thud. Master tier warriors in the outer rings crumpled immediately, eyes bulging as their knees hit the ground, their bodies collapsing face first into the dirt as their weapons fell from nerveless fingers. The second line of masters struggled for a few agonizing seconds longer, veins popping along their temples as they tried to channel mana in resistance, only for their wills to shatter under the relentless pressure, leaving them twitching weakly before falling still. Grandmasters were forced to lock their stances, legs spread wide as they braced themselves against invisible currents that threatened to fold them in half, their own wills flaring desperately like candles in a gale. While the Transcendents gritted their teeth, their bloodshot eyes fixed on Leo as they tried to stabilize their squads, barking orders through clenched jaws even as their spines bowed unwillingly. "So this is what your so-called righteous army is really made of," Leo said, his expression calm as he watched hundreds of thousands drop across the field like stalks of grain flattened by a storm. "Before a single cult soldier, you're nothing but ants," he murmured. His aura intensifying further as he pushed it up to the maximum his body could produce. FWOOM. The already brutal pressure doubled, turning the battlefield into a choking nightmare. Grandmasters who had been barely standing dropped to one knee, some vomiting blood, others passing out entirely as their minds simply failed to keep up. Transcendents had their limbs feel as though they were weighed down with mountains, their thoughts slowing as instinct screamed at them to retreat, to flee, to abandon any thought of fighting this alone. However, it was already too late, as what followed was less a fight and more a systematic execution. Slash. Slash. Thud. Leo cut down the Transcendents first, his body flickering between them like a shadow given form, as each step brought him in front of another top lieutenant who were the top priority for him to eliminate. SHLICK. Crack. One Legion commander's neck parted in a clean line. Another had his chest pierced through before he could complete a defensive technique. While a third tried to unleash an area skill, only for his casting arm to vanish at the elbow, followed by his head. Thud. 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 With every transcendent that fell, the morale of the soldiers around them lost coherence, as the belief that they could weather this storm quickly disappeared. Minutes stretched into hours. Leo waded through living waves of soldiers, each step painting fresh arcs of crimson through the air as his daggers sheared through armor, bone and flesh alike with unerring purpose, his movements devoid of wasted motion, his expression calm even as the world around him turned into a literal river of blood. Artillery lines were shattered. Tank columns were sliced into scrap. Emergency dropships were severed mid-takeoff, their crews never making it off the ground. Each time a new battalion arrived from orbit or distant sectors, it met the same fate. His aura weakened them. His blades finished them. As under the relentless grind of his killing campaign, disciplined formations devolved into panicked clusters, then into fleeing mobs, then finally into silent mounds of cooling flesh. By the time 8 hours had passed, the sounds of battle had faded into nothing. There were no more shouted orders. No more artillery booms. No more engines roaring overhead. Only the quiet crackling of scattered fires, the distant groan of collapsing structures, and the faint, lingering echoes of screams that no longer existed. Leo exhaled, feeling the ache in his limbs at last, as he withdrew his aura in a slow, controlled manner, allowing the atmosphere to lighten little by little, although there was no one left conscious to appreciate the relief. What remained of Sector 11 and the surrounding plains barely qualified as a battlefield anymore. It was a graveyard. As far as the eye could see, the land had transformed into a grotesque landscape of corpses, charred wreckage and congealed blood that turned the soil black and red. Bodies lay in overlapping layers, piled so densely in some areas that the original ground was no longer visible, and was instead replaced by a morbid terrain of limbs and armor. Streams of blood had flowed together during the worst of the slaughter, forming dark rivulets that carved their way between the heaps of the dead, pooling in shallow craters until they reflected the smoky sky above like stagnant, crimson mirrors. While in the middle of it all, a particularly high mound of bodies rose above the rest, formed from officers, elite squads and failed vanguards who had tried to push closest to Leo and paid the price for their bravery. Leo sat atop that mound with his elbows resting loosely on his knees, his daggers planted point first into the flesh and armor beneath his feet, his chest rising and falling slowly as he caught his breath. The smell of iron and burned oil clung to everything. The wind carried nothing but ash and silence. For a long moment, he simply sat there, eyes half closed, listening to the nothingness he had created. Then, without a word, he reached into his robes and drew out the Emperor Suppression Manual. The familiar weight settled into his palm as he opened it, the pages turning with a soft rustle that somehow felt louder than all the explosions that had shaken the planet over the last few hours. As a line of shimmering red text floated up before his eyes, clear and undeniable. Target extermination progress, 432 million 2 billionths. Leo stared at the numbers in silence, allowing the magnitude to sink in. 432 million lives. 432 million deaths. All compressed into a single brutal offensive on a single planet. 432 million, he repeated under his breath, his voice quiet, neither proud nor regretful, simply acknowledging what had been done. Not bad, that's enough progress for one planet, he said, as he closed the manual with a soft snap. Snap. The book vanished back into his storage ring as he pushed himself slowly to his feet, standing tall atop the mountain of corpses, his silhouette framed against the blood-stained horizon, as the first cold gusts of wind began to sweep across the dead plains of Nemo. There is still work to do, Leo murmured, as he took one last look at the silent graveyard he had created, before turning his gaze toward the sky once more, already thinking of the next world that would burn. But before that, he had a commander to kill and a humiliation tape to release to the universe. Chapter 822 Arriving on Ixtal. Meanwhile Ixtal, near Soren's castle, Amanda's POV. The shuttle's engines hummed softly beneath her feet as the clouds parted, revealing the familiar yet distant sight of Ixtal spread out below, its scarred lands slowly healing beneath a pale sky, as Amanda held her sons a little closer and let out a breath she had not realized she had been holding until now. "We are here, boys, the real universe," she murmured, as Caleb pressed his face to the viewport with serious eyes, while little Myron clung to her sleeve, wide-eyed and curious. Behind them, Su-pei stood with his arms crossed, posture relaxed yet alert, as Dumpy loomed in the rear compartment in his 15-foot frog form, golden eyes half-lidded as if he were bored with the journey, yet Amanda had known him long enough to know that the beast was paying attention to everything. Hiss. The shuttle touched down on the clearing near Soren's stone castle, its landing gear hissing as it settled into the soil, as the ramp lowered with a dull mechanical thud that echoed across the quiet open space. Outside, figures had already started gathering. Men, women and a few adolescents in worn armor and patched clothes, survivors of Ixtal who had chosen to stay under Soren's protection, approached cautiously as they tried to peer through the glare of the open hatch. "Stay close," Amanda whispered to Myron and Caleb, as she took their hands and stepped forward, feeling both pairs of small fingers tighten around her own. The air outside was cooler than she expected, while the wind carried with it the faint scent of stone, herbs and old ash. "Who are you? What business do you have on Ixtal?" one of the survivors asked, as he raised his spear and closed in around the craft, with many more following suit, as they too did not recognize Amanda. Amanda began, as she tried to introduce herself as Leo's wife, to mention Soren, to explain that they were here to stay under the great god's protection. However, she never got the chance, as before she could mutter another word. Thump. Dumpy hopped past her in a single step that shook the ground, his massive frog body landing between her and the group of survivors, his webbed feet digging into the soil as he straightened to his full towering height, arms folded over his chest as his gaze hardened into something cold and dangerous. "How dare you pathetic mongrels point a weapon at Lord Father's wife and children," Dumpy rumbled, his voice resonating through the clearing in a deep, guttural tone that made even Amanda's bones vibrate. "I will give you 3 seconds to lower them," he continued, golden eyes narrowing. "Otherwise, I shall not hesitate to kill you all," he threatened, as panic rippled through the gathered crowd at once. Some yelped and staggered back, their weapons jerking downward on reflex. Others scrambled behind their companions, while a few simply stood frozen in place, gripping their spears with shaking hands as their courage battled their survival instincts. Lord Soren, help! Voices rose in shrill cries as several of them turned and shouted toward the castle, fear amplifying the desperation in their throats, as the atmosphere grew tense enough that Amanda had to suppress the urge to step in front of Dumpy and calm everyone down herself. Dumpy, she said softly, tugging Myron and Caleb a little closer, you are scaring them. Good, Dumpy muttered, his gaze never leaving the trembling survivors, as if he truly meant every word he had just spoken. Step. Sigh. A quiet sigh drifted from behind Amanda as Supe finally moved forward, pinching the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers as if he were nursing a headache, before lifting his hand slowly in a non-threatening gesture. Do not mind the frog, Supe said, his tone calm and almost weary, as he came to stand between Dumpy and the survivors while still careful to keep Amanda and the children in his protective reach. I am Supe, a monarch of the cult, and Lord Shadow Dragon's aide, he introduced, his voice carrying clearly through the clearing. Behind me are his family members. His wife, his children and his pet beast, Supe continued, nodding lightly toward Amanda, Myron, Caleb and Dumpy in turn. We are here to seek shelter on Ixtal until the cult army returns. He shared, as the tension among the survivors shifted instantly. Confusion and fear gave way to shock, then to dawning recognition, as murmurs spread through the group like a wave. Shadow Dragon's family. Those are his children. Then that woman is. The man who had pointed the spear earlier swallowed hard, his face flushing with shame as he lowered his weapon completely and stepped forward, bowing his head deeply. Oh, forgive me, ma'am, he said in a rush, his voice thick with apology. Forgive my insolence for pointing a weapon at you. I had no idea who you were. Amanda offered him a small, composed smile, despite her heart still beating faster than usual. It is all right, she replied softly. You were only being careful. Beside her, Myron frowned very seriously at the man, his small brows furrowing as he half hid behind Amanda's leg. Bad uncle, Myron muttered, pointing a tiny accusing finger at the man, as Caleb clung silently to Amanda's skirt, his big eyes watching everything with a quiet mixture of fascination and unease. Amanda gently patted Myron's head, smoothing down his hair as she tried not to laugh. He was just scared, she whispered to her son. He is not a bad uncle, just a worried one. She explained, as before Myron could respond, another sound rolled across the clearing. What is all this ruckus? A deep, commanding voice asked, the tone casual yet carrying enough weight that everyone stiffened. Instinctively. Who dares threaten my citizens on Ixtal? The voice asked, as Amanda turned her head along with everyone else. As Soren emerged from the entrance of the stone castle, his footsteps unhurried as he descended the short flight of stairs, his eyes reflecting the dull light of Ixtal's sky. As the survivors reacted instantly to his presence. Every person in the clearing, from the spear wielder to the nervous women and adolescents, dropped to one knee in almost perfect unison, heads bowed low as they greeted him. My lord, they said together, their voices overlapping as respect and fear blended into reverence. Amanda followed their lead without hesitation, gently guiding Myron and Caleb down with her, as she bent her knee on the ground, her head lowered even as she sneaked a sideways look at Soren from beneath her lashes. Everyone knelt. Everyone except Dumpy. The frog remained standing where he was, arms still folded, golden eyes fixed on Soren with an unblinking, challenging calm that made the air tighten almost imperceptibly. Soren's gaze flicked over the kneeling crowd, then stopped on Dumpy, as he raised a single eyebrow in faint irritation. The old god unable to understand as to why the beast won't bow before him. My apologies, old man, but this frog already has a master, Dumpy said, breaking the quiet first, his tone firm yet oddly respectful in its own way. I only bow before Lord Father, and no one else, he concluded, as the survivors held their breath, eyes darting nervously between Soren and the frog who dared address him so casually. PFF'd. Soren snorted softly, the faintest hint of amusement tugging at the corner of his mouth as he regarded Dumpy for another moment, clearly weighing whether the disrespect was worth crushing, before eventually deciding that he wasn't worth the hassle. What a loyal beast, he said while shaking his head, as his gaze shifted away from the frog. and finally settled on Amanda and the two small bodies kneeling beside her. As looking at them, his expression shifted to one of genuine surprise. Ever so slightly. Those children, he murmured under his breath, his voice so low that Amanda almost did not catch it. They share my blood, Soren said, as his eyes narrowed thoughtfully, the faint golden strands of fate that only he could perceive shimmering into view as they linked him to the boys at Amanda's side. Myron shifted uncomfortably under the weight of his gaze, gripping Amanda's sleeve tighter, while Caleb peeked up curiously, sensing something but not understanding what. Amanda looked up as well, feeling a strange chill run along her spine. As though some invisible web had just tightened itself around all of them, changing something subtle but important in a way she could not yet define. Soren held their gaze for a heartbeat longer, before then exhaling. Slowly. Huff. Come in, he said finally, his tone casual once more, as if he were inviting acquaintances instead of strangers. I have not had casual visiting guests over in forever, he added, his lips curving in a faint, wry smile. But I suppose I can make an exception for you, he said, as he turned his back to them and gestured toward the open doorway of the stone castle. Is it okay to go in? Amanda asked Su-pei as soon as Soren turned, as Su-pei nodded confidently, his monarch senses picking up no killing intent leaking from Soren, which meant that the old god meant no harm. It's okay, he confirmed, as Amanda carefully guided Caleb and Myron into the castle, her own heart beating fast, as she remained flanked by Su-pei and Dumpy, who were ready to protect her to the bitter end should things go south. Chapter 823 Bloodline. Planet Ixtal, inside Soren's castle, Amanda's POV. The interior of Soren's stone castle was warmer than Amanda expected, lit gently by floating mana lamps that cast a soft, amber glow across the corridors as she followed the old god through the ancient halls, her sons walking quietly at her side while Su-pei and Dumpy trailed behind her like silent guardians. The scent of aged stone mixed with the faint aroma of herbs drifted from deeper within the castle, as the corridor eventually opened into a broad courtyard behind the structure, where a large open space stretched beneath the sky, surrounded by low stone walls and tall trees that rustled whenever the wind swept by. Is that a training courtyard? Su-pei asked Dumpy, as it was Soren who turned to answer instead. Yes, the old god said, as he led the group towards that courtyard. The ground within the training courtyard was packed with soil that was softened from years of footsteps. While several wooden racks stood near the wall, holding carved stick spears, dull-edged wooden swords, battered shields, and a handful of round doll-like training dummies with painted faces long faded by sun and rain. It looked old, lived in, familiar, like a place filled with memories that had been left untouched for far too long. You may let the children play, Soren suggested, pausing near the edge of the courtyard, his gaze drifting toward the long row of wooden training weapons placed neatly along the racks. These were ours, he added quietly. Mine and Calith's. We used to train here when we were about their age. He shared, as Amanda looked at the open space, then at her children, whose eyes had already lit up in innocent curiosity. Go on, she said gently, as immediately the duo released their grip on her hands, their little feet pattering across the courtyard as they hurried toward the wooden racks. Stay within sight, Amanda reminded gently, as the boys nodded eagerly, already examining the oversized sticks that seemed almost comically tall when held next to their tiny bodies. Meanwhile, Soren moved toward a shaded seating area beneath a stone archway that overlooked the courtyard, where a small table awaited them. Snap! Snapping his fingers, he retrieved a pot of herbal tea and 4 cups from his storage ring, as he gestured for the guests to take a seat. Please, he said, as Amanda sat across him with a grateful exhale, while Su-pei settled beside her with composed silence. These seats are too small for me, Dumpy said, as despite having the ability to shrink to a smaller size if he wished, he chose to sit on the ground instead, as he tacitly put himself between Soren and the kids. Pouring sounds. Soren poured himself a cup first, before then doing the same for others, as he watched the children explore the courtyard with wide-eyed excitement. Caleb reached for a wooden spear at first, touching its length with awe, but his attention soon shifted to the twin wooden daggers resting on a lower rack. Myron mirrored him a moment later, hopping from one foot to the other as he grabbed a dull wooden stick that vaguely resembled a hunting knife. As both boys seemed drawn irresistibly to the daggers rather than the swords, spears or shields, as Soren chuckled softly looking at their behavior. It appears the bloodline carries instinct, he remarked, his voice gentle for once as he took the first sip of tea. Slurp. Across the courtyard, Myron raised his dagger and puffed out his chest proudly. Brother, look, I am a warrior like father now, he declared, his tiny voice filled with earnest pride as he swung the wooden blade with both hands. Swoosh, swoosh. However, despite his eagerness, Caleb only disappointedly shook his head in response, his face serious as he said, "No, father fights with 2 daggers. If you want to be like father, you need one in each hand," he instructed, as he rummaged through the weapon rack with clumsy determination, before soon finding another dagger-like knife for Myron to pick. "Ooh, okay," the little one said, as he grabbed the second wooden dagger with joy, before then raising both above his head triumphantly. "Arrrrrrr," he shouted, letting out the most adorable battle cry the courtyard had probably heard in centuries, as Caleb burst into laughter beside him. "Ha ha ha, children," Soren said with a smile, the corners of his eyes softening as he watched the boys run and swing their daggers at the harmless dummies, their movements wild and uncontrolled yet full of life. "This is why I continue fighting," Soren began, his tone lowering into something somber as he set down his cup and rested his elbows on his knees. Amanda glanced toward him, sensing the shift in his mood. "I fight so that our future can enjoy their childhoods in peace. So that children remain children for as long as possible, before society forces them to harden into warriors," Soren continued, his gaze never leaving the 2 small figures practicing clumsy attacks on the wooden dummies. Su-pei nodded slowly, his expression reflective, while Amanda nodded as well, her heart softening at the sincerity in Soren's words, as she held her teacup with both hands, allowing the warmth to seep into her palms. "I used to play just like this with my older brother Caleb," he said, his eyes distant as memories pulled him backward through time. "My father sat right here in this very spot, drinking tea, watching us. With tired patience," he reminisced, as Amanda could almost picture it. 2 young boys racing barefoot across the courtyard, swinging wooden swords under the sun. "However, we were never this peaceful," Soren admitted, a faint smirk appearing on his lips. "There were so many practice dolls available, yet we preferred attacking each other. But since Caleb was older and stronger, I always lost." He shook his head lightly, the memory almost fond. "It took me years to beat him. And when I finally did, I think that was one of the happiest moments of my youth," Soren finished, as Amanda and Su-pei exchanged small understanding smiles. Dumpy remained silent throughout the monologue, sipping the tea with slow enjoyment, though Amanda could tell he was listening closely. Soren's gaze drifted back to the boys once more. "I hope these children stay together for life and never turn on one another," he continued softly. "They are destined to become great warriors if they do not fall too soon," he praised, as Amanda stiffened subtly at his words. Up until now, she had never truly imagined her sons becoming fighters, following Leo's dangerous path. The idea filled her with both pride and dread, tangled into an emotion she could not name. "If they stick together, they will be unstoppable," Soren concluded, his voice mellow yet firm. "There is nothing brothers cannot conquer when their bond remains unbroken." He leaned back as the wind rustled the courtyard trees, carrying the laughter of the boys toward them. "However, more often than not, they do not stick together," he said grimly, as Dumpy finally intervened with a decisive nod. "They will be fine," Dumpy said, his tone filled with quiet certainty. "I do not know who your father was. But I know their father. And because I know him, I know they will be fine," he said, as Soren snorted at his words. Snort. "You know, if I were younger, I would wrestle you right here, frog," Soren muttered, shaking his head. "But I am at a stage of life where I am beyond that nonsense," he said, as Dumpy clicked his tongue lightly and reached into his storage ring, as he pulled out a small folded letter sealed in old wax. "Here, this is something I have been safekeeping for you," he said, sliding the letter across the table toward Soren, who picked it up with cautious curiosity. "What is this?" Soren asked, turning the envelope over to examine the seal. "The smoking man gave it to me many years ago, before he died," Dumpy explained, folding his arms as he leaned back. He said I must hand it over to you personally. So I have been holding onto it ever since. He shared, as Soren felt his heart tighten unexpectedly as he stared at the letter. Charles left me a message before he died. He wondered, the weight of old memories swelling in his chest, as the courtyard suddenly felt quieter, the world narrowing around the piece of paper in his hand. As with slow, careful fingers, Soren broke the seal and began to read. Chapter 824, Charles's last message. Planet Ixtal, inside Soren's castle, Soren's POV. For a brief moment after unfolding the letter, Soren did not dare read it. He simply sat staring at it, the thin parchment resting in his palm like something far heavier than its size could justify, as though the weight of an entire lifetime had been folded into that small rectangle. The wax seal had cracked slightly with age, yet Charles's handwriting upon the front remained steady, unmistakable, and painfully familiar. Sniff. The letter still carried with it the faint scent of smoke. The same brand Charles used to frequent, as despite the years having passed, the parchment still retained a faint smell of that cigarette that he probably smoked while writing this. Huh. This letter sure smells like you, old friend. Soren thought, as he finally began to read the first lines. Old friend, if you are reading this, then I am already dead. By the time this reaches you, the righteous scum would have likely overrun Juxta, and the cult would be facing an existential crisis. I am sorry, old friend. I know what that world meant to you. I tried to protect it the way you asked me to. But I am not you. I am only mortal, and I have reached the end of what my mortal limits can do. Soren's fingers curled around the edges of the parchment as he read. His knuckles whitening slowly. He had prepared himself for these words. He knew Charles was gone. He had known Charles was dead back when he was inside the black hole itself, however, while knowing it was one thing, reading it in Charles's own hand was something else entirely. Idiot, Soren whispered, though the word lacked anger. It trembled with grief instead. You should have retreated. Although I cherish Juxta, you were worth more to me than every planet under cult rule. He whispered, before then forcing himself to continue. Do not carry this failure for me. Juxta falling was never your responsibility alone, and it was never mine alone either. Forging that blade was important. And if I knew this was going to be the outcome of your absence, I'd still choose to do things this way, as I'd gladly sacrifice my life for an origin blade, rather than you not having one. Charles shared, as Soren felt his eyes water at those words. Charles knew the risks when he agreed to let Soren leave the cult, and yet, he did not blame Soren for it. This is exactly why I can never replace you, old friend. For although I may find a more capable warrior, I'll never find a vice sect master as selfless as you. He whispered, as he forced the water in his eyes to dry up before continuing. In your absence, the young dragons have stepped forward big time. Surprising even me. Rough around the edges, stubborn as hell, reckless in ways that remind me far too much of you, but they have that special spark about them. The kind of fire you only see once in a few millennia. Charles praised, as Soren raised an eyebrow at his words. I wish I had more time to shape them properly. They probably needed more of me than I could give, but fate does not bargain with men like us. Still, I can say this with all the certainty left in my bones. If those two survive long enough, the cult's flame will never die. They have what it takes. Both of them. Charles wrote, as a faint, shaky exhale left Soren. He stared at the words for several seconds, letting their truth settle deep inside him. He had already known Leo possessed the potential for greatness, and that Charles had a special soft corner for the boy. However, what he did not expect was for Charles to praise Ver so highly as well. If Leo and Ver are still alive when you read this, then I have one last request, old friend. If you still have some life left in you, and you're capable enough of passing down some of your insights to them, go out of your way to do it. I know you're not big on teaching, and that you don't like to pass down your insights when it comes to battle. But make an exception just this once. Even if it's for a single sparring session. Let those two feel what it's like at the summit of universal power. For I feel like if they see it once themselves, they will surely reach it. Someday, Charles shared, as Soren shook his head side to side reading those words. Sigh. You think that highly of them, huh? He muttered, before then chuckling at his own physical condition, as He absolutely hated the idea of undergoing a sparring session with this dying body, however, resolved to do it regardless, just for Charles. Leo in particular, I feel, is the second coming of the timeless assassin. As even though both boys are talented, that kid is in a league of his own. And I know you feel like I'm too biased as his teacher, but believe me when I say, this is my honest assessment of that kid. For if Leo, with his mentality and talent still can't become as great as you and your father, then I don't know who can. Charles wrote, as Soren nodded in agreement to his words. Although he wasn't sure whether anyone could ever become a warrior as great as his father, he did believe Leo had the potential to come close. With him dying rapidly now, Leo was the man he planned on entrusting the cult next to, not because he was ready, but because he was the only one left who could possibly endure that burden. As with Charles gone and his own life fading, he felt like he had no other choice. Sigh. Exhaling slowly, he turned to the next line on the letter, as the ink in this section seemed more blotted and messy, as if this were a part that Charles wrote while losing his calm. Chapter 825 Thank you for everything. As Soren glanced towards the next section of the letter, he immediately noticed that the ink here was darker and more uneven, as though Charles's hand had trembled or pressed too hard against the parchment while writing it. The strokes looked harsher, the pressure heavier, betraying a moment where emotion had clearly spilled over the edges of his composure. That small detail alone made Soren straighten his spine and adjust his grip on the letter, his breath slowing as he prepared himself to read the next part, knowing instinctively that whatever followed would not be any easier to bear than what had already come before, yet accepting that he had no choice but to continue. This next part, only read it if you already have the origin blades and the confidence to kill gods with them. For if you do not, then I have nothing more to say that will help you, old friend. But if you do, then give what I am about to write next some very serious thoughts. Charles wrote, as Soren's expression hardened, the courtyard fading from his awareness until only the page remained before him. In my understanding of the universal dynamics of power, I believe Helmuth the Berserker is the glue holding Caliph and Morris allied. And by extension, he is the glue holding the entire righteous alliance together. As without Helmuth, I feel their cooperation will collapse. Charles wrote, as Soren's breath shortened a little. He knew Charles was right in this line of thought. However, at this moment, he did not want Charles to be right. In his mind, he already knew that without Helmuth, the righteous alliance would likely not remain in one piece. If left alone with Morris, Caliph would not remain in such an alliance with a man of Morris's temperament. While with Morris and Caliph separating, the great clans would abandon the current order under the universal government and a chaotic era would rise, where every power acted for itself. He mused, as although the logical side of him knew that Helmuth had to be the highest priority target for him to take down, the emotional side of him rejected that thought violently. For his blades did not hunger for Helmuth's head, but rather hungered for Caliph instead. I know your killing intent burns for the blood of your brother. And trust me, I want nothing less than the worst punishment for that betrayer for what he did to you and your father. However, for the cult's future, killing Helmuth first makes more sense. For even if Caliph dies, Morris and Helmuth will stay allied. But if Helmuth dies, everything ends. The universal government will collapse. Charles wrote, the ink strokes jagged in this section, as if his frustration had bled directly into the page. Clench. So that's what you want to tell me. Soren thought, his teeth clenching tightly, as he felt his jaw ache. You want me to go after a secondary target first, just because it is logically the right thing to do. Despite knowing my personal history with Caliph. Old friend, I've waited for this battle for over 2 millennia. Surely you don't expect me to give up killing Caliph first in favor of a mere Helmuth. Soren thought emotionally, as he continued reading. I know how much you have sacrificed for the cult, old friend. And that you deserve closure in your final battle, closure for your father's death. But as your vice sect master, and the only friend you ever allowed into your heart, it is my duty to show you the right path. Charles wrote, as Soren felt the storm rise inside him again, violent and choking, a whirlwind of rage and grief that he could barely contain. He hated the truth Charles was forcing him to face. He hated the logic. He hated that Charles was right. He hated that fate had placed the burden of the cult's future in his dying hands. He hated all of it. But more than anything, he hated that Charles, his only friend, was the one showing him this truth mirror, as although he could have screamed at him if this were a one-on-one conversation, he could not do so now. In the end, the choice is yours. And believe me when I say, I would like nothing better than you killing every god in the universe, starting with Caliph. But if you must pick just one, I suggest you go after Helmuth first. Charles wrote, as Soren shut his eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply. As the courtyard wind rustled the leaves overhead, he knew this decision would come someday. However, he just did not expect it to wound him this deeply. Regardless, he continued to read, his eyes falling on the last section of the letter. As I write this last part, I feel more relief than fear because I know I will die honorably and while defending the cult, which to be fair is how I always imagined myself being taken out. Was my life the best it could have been? No. Could I have reached demigod if I had pushed harder? Maybe. Do I have regrets? Plenty. But was I happy with how I spent my years? Absolutely. Charles wrote, as Soren's lips parted just slightly, a tremble forming there before he forced it still. So in the end, I am simply grateful. Grateful for the journey. Grateful for the cult. Grateful for the honor of serving at your side as your vice-sect master. And while I have more regrets than I can count, the only one that truly stings is not being able to say goodbye to you in person. He wrote, as Soren froze. Every word written in this section struck him like a blade. Every sentence sinking deeper than the last. As his chest tightened until breathing itself became a conscious effort. So I say it here, through this letter instead. Goodbye, old friend. I will see you on the other side. Charles wrote, as the ink on the final line seemed smudged by thick fingers, as if Charles had written it and decided that it felt too cringe. And decided to rub it off, only to find out that ink could not be removed that way. Fool. Soren muttered, as he suspected that Charles had probably already known that his death was inevitable when he wrote this letter, yet instead of saving his own life and running away, he stood his ground to face it like a man. There's no goodbye between friends. He muttered softly, as despite his best efforts to hold them back, tears began to stream freely down his face, as he felt the pinch of losing Charles all over again. But since you said it first, I'll say it too. Goodbye old friend. And thank you for everything. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And please support the author by link in description. Chapter 826 Meltdown. Planet Ixtal, Soren's Castle, Soren's POV. Crinkle. Fold. Soren bit his lip as he folded the letter, his eyes still moist as he pressed the parchment flat between his fingers in an attempt to regain the composure that had slipped from him moments ago. The faint laughter of Caleb and Myron playing in the courtyard slowly drifted out of his awareness, replaced by the steady thrum of his own heartbeat, as he focused on slowing it down with focused breaths. How pathetic have I become to be so emotional over a mere letter? He wondered, as he set the parchment gently on the table, his hand lingering atop it as though anchoring himself to something fragile yet irreplaceable. Across from him, Amanda, Supe and Dumpy remained in respectful silence, each giving him the space they knew he needed. My apologies, he said quietly, his tone still rough around the edges. It seems I lost myself for a moment, he said, as Amanda rose slightly from her seat, her expression warm and steady as she offered him a gentle smile. It's all right, she said, her voice softening further as she met his gaze. If you need some time to yourself, we can leave you in peace. We don't want to burden you, she offered, as her sincerity gave him room to exhale, his shoulders loosening a fraction as the tension around his chest eased. Yes, he murmured, nodding slowly as his eyes drifted back toward the folded letter. That would be best. I would prefer some quiet today, as there is much I need to think about, he said, as he let his fingers graze the parchment's edge. Let us continue this lovely tea session tomorrow, for I need to make up for this inconvenience I have caused you today, he said, as Amanda nodded immediately in agreement. Of course. Thank you for welcoming us today, she said, as she turned toward her children with Supe and Dumpy following behind her. Myron. Caleb. Time to go, she called, as the boys turned from the wooden dummies they had been assaulting with wholehearted enthusiasm, their tiny wooden daggers clenched tightly in small fists. And although Myron looked ready to protest, Caleb tugged him gently, guiding him back toward their mother with quiet maturity, as together the four of them left Soren's castle at once. Dash 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 dash. Meanwhile, on the Galaxy Net. The Galaxy Net servers stuttered for a brief moment as two videos dropped back to back, both carrying the same uploader tag. Uploader: Shadow Dragon's Second Fang, source origin unknown. The first video opened with Commander Yuzu screaming, sobbing, begging naked, as Leo dragged him by the hair across a blood-soaked floor. His voice cracked as he pleaded. His knees buckled, his dignity dying long before his body did, as Leo showed him no sympathy whatsoever. Leo decapitated him, before looking into the camera, as although he spoke no words, it was clear by the fury in his eyes that this video was the cult's response to the humiliation that Ver had suffered at the righteous faction's hands. "He's first, but any of you can be next," he said before cutting the tape, as the comment counters on this video spiked into millions within minutes of it being uploaded. Holy shit. Did this really happen? Am I dreaming? Or was that spineless coward really a righteous faction commander? The netizens wondered, as although the first video was shocking in itself, what made the situation even worse was the second one that was released alongside it. As in the second one, Leo stood alone on the ruined plains of planet Nemo, surrounded by a sea of corpses, whose blood pooled to form small streams merging into a tiny river. Nemo is first to fall. But your planet can be next. I am sure many of you laughed at the cult's supposed demise. However, backing a wounded beast into a corner is never a wise choice, for you never know when the beast stops retreating and chooses to pounce forward instead. Leo said in this second video, his voice calm yet threatening, as those who listened to it could not help but feel a chill run down their spine. Leo did not shout, there was no fury in his tone, and yet within a few hours, his words caused an online meltdown to start on the Galaxy Net. Dash 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 dash. Comment thread: Righteous Faction News Hub. Viewers: 237,221,004. Live updating. Spurgeon 54. Is this true? Somebody tell me this is another cult propaganda clip. Nemo cannot be gone. It cannot. Robin Hood. My brother was dispatched to Nemo. I have been calling for 20 minutes. There is no response. None of his friends are picking up either. I feel sick already. Dinizer. Established. Yuzu is dead. Confirmed by internal sources. The humiliation footage is real. The kill timestamp predates the broadcast. Terry_Williams. I thought Soren was the only monster capable of conquering a planet alone. How does the cult have another? What kind of training did they put their warriors through to create something like Skyshard? Cervantes 91. One man cannot kill that many soldiers in that time frame. He had an army. He had two. Please someone tell me he had support. Ace King 137. The terrain damage matches concentrated, single-user energy traces. I studied battlefield signatures. This was not an army. This was one man. Shard_6761. That second video ruined me. I have never felt fear like that. There is no emotion in his voice. None. He speaks like death itself learned to walk. Lord Mongrel 327. We provoked them. We invaded their worlds. We mocked their messiah. We pushed them into a corner. And now the most feral parts of the cult are off their leash. We did this. Seraphim G1. Do not talk like that. The cult deserves worse. We will retaliate. We always retaliate. Highlander Charles. Retaliate against what? They literally have nothing left to lose anymore. Sonny Booney. Skyshard said any world can be next. Any. Do you understand what that means? It means our home planet can be invaded tomorrow. Either by him, or Soren. But either way, we are screwed. Atomic VIP 3R. No. No. I refuse to accept this. These videos are staged. They must be staged. Nobody can conquer a planet alone. The cult is bluffing. Right. Right. Laisha_Jenkins. People do not shake like Yuzu shook in staged videos. LilJ 439. Stop. Stop saying that. I want to believe something else. Anything else. Buckley. Where are the universal government officials? Why have none of them come forward with videos debunking this massacre? Doc the Sailor Man. They are silent because they are afraid. Because they know this is real. Because they know they have no answer to Skyshard. Echo 966. This marks the first time since ancient times that a single individual who is not a god has exterminated a full military planet alone. The precedent is catastrophic. Teo Swig. People forget Leo is young. Too young. If he is already capable of this, what will he be in a century? Where do his limits lie? Waffle. If you invade a beast's den, do not cry when the beast bites back. Do not cry when it tears your hand off. Do not cry when it learns to enjoy the taste. Stana_4351. This is the consequence of the government ignoring centuries of warnings. They said the cult was contained. They said Soren was dying. They said the cult's dragons were weak. They lied. They always lie. Blanket. This is not a war anymore. This is retaliation. This is vengeance. Busolos. This is only the beginning. Dash 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 dash. By the end of the first hour, the videos had crossed 600 billion views. By the end of the second, riots began in 3 outer colonies. By the end of the third, a universal government official finally appeared on screen. Pale, sweating, trembling as he delivered a statement that convinced no one. For although the righteous faction had always claimed strength, stability, and divine mandate, something had shifted irreversibly. For the first time, the citizens witnessed proof that Soren was not the only calamity the cult had raised. That there was another, younger, faster, colder, hungrier. And if the cult could still produce monsters as capable as Skyshard, then they were still a long way from not being considered serious universal threats anymore. As that broke their morale more than watching their own commander beg for mercy or being whipped naked. Chapter 827 Taking Note. Meanwhile, Su Yong. The video Leo released spread through the universe like wildfire, reaching even the Su-controlled lands within minutes. Su Yong watched it alone in a quiet chamber, the monitor's glow flickering across his shocked face. Leo, you conquered an entire planet alone. He whispered, unable to tear his eyes away as the recording repeated again. The first video disturbed him enough. Yu Zhu, a commander of the righteous faction being dragged by the hair and butchered like livestock. Leo's expression cold, unchanging, absolute. But the second video, the one on Nemo, that was the one that hollowed Su Yang's chest completely. Leo stood over a world swallowed in corpses. Not squads. Not battalions. An entire military planet. Su Yang leaned back slowly, his breath unsteady as he stared at the screen in disbelief. Is this the same Leo the first used to spar in Rodova with? The same guy the first called my brother and rival. The same guy the first thought I would outpace to become monarch. He wondered, as he tightened his grip around his own arm, almost as if grounding himself. How did you reach this stage so fast? How did you become something I cannot even comprehend anymore? He thought quietly, as a cold heaviness filled him inch by inch. He replayed the memory of their first duel at Rodova. They were evenly matched then. Different styles, but comparable in results. Two stubborn kids chasing the same ceiling. Now, Leo had stepped far, far above that ceiling. So far that Su Yang felt he could not even see the man's footsteps anymore. What path are you walking, Leo? He murmured, staring at Leo's still figure in the footage, surrounded by hundreds of millions of dead soldiers. And what path am I even on? The question settled in his mind like a stone, suffocating, unwelcome, yet impossible to ignore. If Leo can do this now, what will he become later? And what will I be in comparison? He swallowed hard, feeling a bitter mix of pride and inadequacy coil in his chest. We used to stand side by side, but now I cannot even understand the world you are fighting in. His voice lowered into something almost defeated. I hate this feeling. He closed the hologram with a tight jaw, as silence filled the room around him. Leo, just how far ahead have you gone without me? And how do I even begin to catch up? He wondered, as although he acknowledged the fact that he was too far behind right now, he did not lose the desire to bridge that gap somehow. Dash 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 dash. Meanwhile, on the Eternal Garden, Raymond's POV. The Eternal Garden was quiet, almost unnaturally so. The floating petals that orbited Raymond's figure drifted with slow, careful grace, as though they too sensed the subtle shift in the air as he stood before the holographic screen, eyes narrowed, jaw clenched with an emotion far too controlled to be called anger. The two videos had finished playing long ago. Yet Raymond had not moved. He stared at the silent screen, fingers loosely interlaced behind his back, the faint chirp of the garden's birds the only sound accompanying him. Sigh. A long breath escaped his lungs, as he shook his head from side to side. Leo Skyshard. He whispered the name as though tasting it, as the name itself seemed to evoke a sense of disgust inside him, which made him dislike the person from the get-go. I had almost forgotten about you, he said, as his eyes lowered slightly, remembering the faint reports that arose when Leo and Ver had started an expansion streak whereby they conquered a few righteous faction planets together. Back then, Leo was barely notable for him, as he was nothing more than a boy with enough talent to climb but not enough to matter. Someone who would rise, fight a bit, die young, or retire quietly. A minor existence. But now, Raymond clicked his tongue softly. Planet-level devastation, he murmured, and at your age. There was no awe in his tone. No admiration. Only the steady appraisal of a man adjusting a threat assessment. He lifted one hand, turning it slowly, as though feeling the weight of invisible implications settle onto his palm. So the bloodline of the timeless assassin truly survives outside my own. He muttered, as just saying those words made his frown deepen. That's dangerous, he said, as he spoke those words without the slightest change in expression, yet the space itself seemed to react, the petals floating around him shivering faintly, while the light in the garden seemed to dim by a shade. Step. Raymond turned away from the screen and walked, his each step measured and controlled, as he continued to ponder more on this topic. I ignored you before because you were unworthy of my attention, he said, his voice low, even, almost conversational. Because back then your ceiling seemed harmless. Because your path seemed predictable. But that's not the case anymore. Because after today, I acknowledge you as a genuine threat, he said, as he reached the edge of a cliff from where the ocean stretched before him, its beautiful blue and white colors reflecting faintly in his pupils. Today, he continued, you have revealed to the universe something you should not have. He rested his palms on the cold railing, his fingers tapping lightly, rhythmically, the way he always did when making irreversible decisions. You revealed potential. A faint smirk tugged at one corner of his lips. A smirk born not from amusement, nor satisfaction, but something far darker. You showed the universe what you might become, he said, as his eyes narrowed further. And you showed me what you might threaten, he said, as behind him, the holographic screen dimmed, leaving only the echo of Leo's last words ringing faintly in his mind. Ha 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 ha, how reckless of you to roar before your fangs have hardened. A soft laugh escaped him, short, humorless, chilling. You have drawn the gaze of someone you cannot afford to provoke. He straightened slowly, placing his hands behind his back once more. Soren is dying. Ver is as good as dead. The cult is wounded. And yet, they still produce things like you. His head tilted just a fraction. That makes you unacceptable, he concluded, as his decision on what to do with Leo fell into place with a quiet finality. After today, Leo was no longer a threat to be postponed. Nor an existence to be monitored. But rather a weed to be uprooted. We will meet sooner than you expect. Raymond's voice softened until it almost resembled pity. And when we do, I will end you long before you reach the stage where you really matter. His eyes glowed faintly as the garden's petals spiraled around him. You have entered my list, Skyshard. He turned his back to the garden, already walking away, the ocean fading behind him. And once a name enters my list, he said quietly, it never leaves alive. Chapter 828 Careful Planning. Deep space, aboard the cult craft, Leo's POV. Nemo shrank behind him into a dull, dark planet, as his transport ship slipped into deep space, the engines humming in a low steady rhythm as the stars stretched into thin silver threads beyond the cockpit glass. Leo sat alone with his back half slouched in the passenger chair, the cabin around him lit only by the cold light of the main console, as a layered holographic interface unfolded in front of him, each window neatly tagged in Chaosbringer's precise, helpful handwriting. Updated regional target proposal after Nemo conquest. Current kill count, 432 million 2 billionths. His eyes lingered on the numbers for a breath, as he inhaled once and then pushed the emotion aside, because thinking about the scale of it now was only ever going to slow him down. 2 billion, he murmured, almost casually. 1.568 left. He reminded himself, as with a steady tap, he opened the first tab. Tap. A cluster of planets appeared before him in a three-dimensional grid, all within a certain radius of Nemo and marked with floating labels. Ephex, Galmarin, Midova, Vesk Prime, Omega, Aeolian Reach, Voros Gate, Sereth Belt. Chaosbringer had done the broad work already. All of these planets were high militarization zones. However, what remained for him still was filtering out which planets suited his campaign requirements the best, as he did not have time to visit them all. First filter, Leo muttered quietly, his voice calm as his gaze sharpened. Military to civilian ratio, he muttered, as he input the filter in the data slate and opened the output for planet Ephex first. Total population, 1.8 billion. Active soldiers, 210 million. Ratio, roughly 1 soldier to 7 civilians. The data showed, as his jaw tensed for a moment as he studied the numbers. Those are too many civilians for my liking, he muttered, as his finger hovered over the dismiss icon. He needed planets that were almost pure steel. Soldiers, not families. Bases, not cities. Normal worlds usually have 9, 10, 13 civilians to every soldier, he mused, as the projection slowly spun in front of him. If I start burning those, the collateral will be disgusting, and the yield too low for the stain it leaves. He concluded, as sticking to his morals he discarded Ephex as a viable option. Beep. Ephex, discarded. The screen showed, as he opened Galmarin next. Total population, 2.3 billion. Active soldiers, 260 million. Ratio, roughly 1 to 8.8. Better, he muttered, but still not good enough. He said, as he pushed Galmarin aside as well. Beep. Galmarin, discarded. Next, he opened Midova. Total population, 580 million. Active soldiers, 420 million. Ratio, roughly 3 soldiers to 1 civilian. Leo's eyes narrowed slightly. Much better, he noted, as he marked it with a faint mental tick but did not commit yet. This is just step 1, he reminded himself. I want worlds where the uniformed outnumber the helpless. But that can't be my only criteria, he said, as he repeated the process with the others. Vesk Prime. Soldiers, 310 million. Civilians, 110 million. OK ratio. Keep. Omega. Soldiers, 790 million. Civilians, 280 million. On the lower side of my ideal range, but still workable. Maybe. Aeolian Reach. Soldiers, 970 million. Civilians, 95 million. Strong ratio. Excellent. Voros Gate. Soldiers, 160 million. Civilians, 1.2 billion. Trash. Next. Sereth Belt. Soldiers, 620 million. Civilians, 540 million. Maybe, he mused, as for now he decided to keep the ones with higher soldier density and fewer mouths. Which reduced his initial list to just Midova, Vesk Prime, Omega, Aeolian Reach and Sereth for the second round. Next, he muttered, as he flipped open the leadership panels, it is important to see who is sitting on these planets. Because while it was one thing to drown a world in blood, it was another to waste precious hours crossing blades with multiple monarchs when his goal was numbers, not duels. He opened Midova. Leadership Summary. Planetary Commander, 1 High Monarch. Sub-Leadership, Transcendence and below. Leo tilted his head slightly. Good. A single monarch I can probably take down by myself, he said, before moving on to Vesk Prime. Leadership Summary. Permanent Monarch Garrison, 2. 1 stationed in orbit, 1 groundbound, minimal transfer cycle. Leo's lips thinned. 2 monarchs on a fortress world. He did not fear the fight. He simply disliked the trade. Too much time wasted on too few bodies. I am not here to duel vanity projects. Beep. Vesk Prime, discarded. Omega. Leadership Summary. Permanent Monarch Garrison, 1. Sub-Leadership, Transcendence and below. Aeolian Reach. Leadership Summary. Permanent Monarch Garrison, 1. Sub-Leadership, Transcendence and below. Sereth Belt. Leadership Summary. Permanent Monarch Garrison, 2. Sub-Leadership, a junior monarch subservient to a senior one. The report said, as his eyes immediately turned flat reading those words. Out, he said, as he closed it without even blinking. as that choice now reduced his initial viable choices down to just 3 candidates. Midova, Omega and a Leon Reach. Third filter, he reminded himself, shifting to the tactical overlays. Total soldier count means nothing if they are scattered like seeds across an entire crust. He opened the layout for Midova. Dozens of red dots appeared first. Then hundreds. Then the map zoomed out and revealed that the forces were spread across 14 major landmasses, each cluster separated by vast oceans and harsh terrain. Leo watched the pattern for a few seconds, then clicked his tongue in mild frustration. This is annoying. Too much running. Too many dead hours between waves. He needed planets where the armies were folded together like stacked meat, not scattered like crumbs across a kitchen floor. And hence, he pushed Midova into the doubtful column for now, as Omega's overlay opened next. Shine. Spin. The entire planet revolved slowly as a glowing equatorial band lit up around its middle, marked with a chain of mega bases and interlocking fortresses that ran almost seamlessly from one side of the globe to the other, leaving the poles almost empty. Leo's eyes warmed a fraction. Now that, he thought, is efficient. If he controlled the band, he controlled the world. If he crushed the band, he crushed almost every soldier that mattered. Which was why he decided to keep it, and moved on to a Leon Reach next, which turned out to have 3 super dense continental clusters, all within a few hundred kilometers of one another, with the rest of the surface mainly mining towns and low-priority zones. Not as perfect as a single line, he muttered, but close enough. Once I break the main triangle, the rest will crumble. He assessed, as he left a Leon on the list, and reluctantly drifted his gaze back to Midova. Too much travel, too much spread, he decided finally. I want 400 to 500 million kills per planet within 30 hours, not a scavenger hunt. Beep. Midova, discarded. As at that point he was left with only 2 viable choices in Omega and a Leon Reach. However, even then he did additional checks on those planets, such as the nearest reinforcement center to those planets, and their distance from Nemo. As it was not worth it for him to travel to those planets if he could not get at least 32 hours to wreak havoc on them. Or, if it was more than 48 hours away from Nemo. As after checking everything, he instructed the pilot to charter a course for Omega first and a Leon Reach next, as hopefully, if he maximized his kills on both those planets, he could hopefully complete his goal of reaching 2 billion kills within the next 7 days. Chapter 829 Speedrun. Planet Omega, 24 hours later, Leo's POV. It took Leo roughly 24 hours to arrive at Planet Omega from Nemo. However, once he arrived there the situation turned ugly real fast for the righteous faction soldiers stationed on the planet. Almost as soon as his feet touched Omega's soil, men began dying by the thousands, their lives snuffed out by the weight of his aura alone. The equatorial fortress band that stretched endlessly along the planet's midline became his designated kill zone, a continuous chain where 790 million soldiers, 1 monarch-tier commander and dozens of transcendents awaited slaughter. Sniff. Leo inhaled once as his aura unfurled, rolling out gently at first before sharpening into something cold, heavy and lethal, as the nearest fortress shuddered beneath the crushing pressure of it. The soldiers stationed inside felt the weight of his aura descend on them before they even saw him, their bodies stiffening, their lungs locking, their thoughts scattering, while Leo walked through the main gate without slowing his steps. Step. Step. The first base fell in under 5 minutes. Dozens of dagger slashes swept through the defensive bunkers, shredding towers, slicing open barriers and carving straight through bodies with lethal precision as hundreds of thousands died before their screams could even form. However, as if dissatisfied with how slow that felt, Leo made the second fortress run even faster. Slash. Slash. Boom. The second fortress collapsed harder than the first. Soldiers scrambled to seal gates, to activate internal shields, to buy even a few seconds of time, yet the moment Leo activated Enhance, he slipped into their corridors like a streak of silver and shadow, executing everyone inside with unhesitating brutality. One swing. 1,000 bodies. One leap. An entire courtyard caved beneath him. His aggression only intensified with bases 3 and 4, his rhythm accelerating, his precision sharpening, his aura growing colder by the minute. The speed of his kills rose exponentially, until by the time 3 hours had passed since his arrival, Leo had already carved through more than 9 million lives. Boom. It was at this moment that a shockwave rippled across the 7th fortress he was attacking, as a large fleet descended from the upper atmosphere, their formation tight and disciplined, their weapons primed in perfect sync. At the center of the formation flew Leslie Wales, a hulking monarch with a long halberd for a weapon, who looked particularly displeased about Leo deciding to attack his planet today. Skyshard. His voice rolled like thunder. I was informed about your arrival by my subordinates a few hours ago. However, I waited until I gathered all my most capable men to come attack you. I'm not stupid like Yuzu. I won't attack you in waves. You will instead feel the full wrath of the Omega defensive forces all at once. He said, as Leo couldn't believe the good news that fell into his ears. Ah, really? You'd do that for me? He said, sounding mock-touched. As Leslie's face turned sour, the monarch unable to understand as to why Leo felt happy about something that was so obviously disadvantageous to him. You're a weird one, Skyshard, but you will fall nonetheless. Men, burn him, Leslie ordered, as his fleet opened fire at once. Boom. Asterisk boom. Asterisk boom. Thousands of mana cannons. Millions of rounds. The sky itself lit up with destructive light as the bombardment swallowed Leo's location whole. However, when the smoke cleared, Leo was nowhere to be found. Where is he? Leslie wondered aloud, his eyes desperately scanning the entire battlefield for any signs of Leo. However, while he looked for him underneath, Leo instead appeared from above him, descending from the sky with both daggers drawn, as he used the move Crown Fall to claim his head. Slash. The monarch's head rolled from a single attack. As Leo timed this entire saga to perfection. He is dead. The commander is dead. The internal comms of the righteous fleets crackled with panic, voices overlapping in terror as every soldier felt the moment their strongest pillar vanished. Lieutenants shouted orders. Legion commanders tried to seize control. But Leo did not grant them even a heartbeat of recovery. His aura suppressed them, yes, but it was his daggers that delivered ruin. Slash. A crescent blade of condensed force ripped upward, cleaving straight through a destroyer's hull as though it were made of cloth. Slash. Another dagger arc flew across the sky, splitting two carriers in half, their engines detonating as burning debris rained across the battlefield. Slash. 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 A rapid series of flicks shredded an entire squadron at once, as 10 ships ruptured in synchronized explosions, their metal frames disintegrating into molten fragments. Kaboom! Without their monarch, the fleets unraveled almost instantly. Formations broke. Cohesion vanished. While fear drowned every remaining command structure, as Leo moved through that chaos like a living executioner. He pierced one cruiser after another, slashing through reinforced armor as if it were foam, killing 1 million soldiers every 5 to 10 minutes with terrifying consistency, as his killing intent sharpened with every life extinguished beneath him. It took him roughly another couple hours to completely wipe off the fleet that Leslie arrived to contain him with. However, once he was done defeating them, there was no resistance worth mentioning left on Omega. Every battalion that he encountered from that fight onwards fell in under 2 minutes. Every fortress he descended upon collapsed in under 5, as Omega itself seemed to devolve into a landscape of broken bones, melted steel and drifting ash. The mighty equatorial band that once represented Omega's military pride gradually thinned under his assault, base by base, fleet by fleet, until the entire planetary defense line resembled nothing more than a ruptured spine broken along its length. What began as organized resistance soon became scattered pockets of panic, then scattered pockets of corpses. And eventually, not even that. So by the time the 32-hour mark quietly arrived, there was nothing left on Omega that could still call itself an army. The world had been emptied, and the only thing that surrounded Leo was a horizon of wreckage and drifting smoke. Alright, I feel like that's enough. But what does the manual say? How much progress have I really made? He wondered, as he lifted the Emperor Suppression Manual and watched the progress numbers update themselves. Progress. 1,032,200,042 billionths. The book displayed, as with a small nod he closed the book. Thud. I've crossed the 50% mark. He mused, as his kill count for Omega exceeded 600 million, which although was not a 100% of soldiers present on the planet, was still good enough for him to be satisfied and move on to the next planet. Chapter 830 Reaching the Goal. Planet Ilion Reach, Leo's POV. It took Leo another 24 hours to reach Ilion Reach from Omega. However, the moment he arrived, the situation unfolded with far more convenience than he expected, as the planet's monarch came out to confront him in under 2 minutes, saving him the trouble of hunting for the strongest defender later. Ducairo of the Du clan stood before him, saber raised, aura sharp, eyes steady with the kind of confidence only a lifetime of victories could forge. Yet while formidable, he was still no match for Leo, who cut him down in under 100 moves, his daggers slipping past the monarch's final guard as naturally as drawing breath. Thud. Once Ducairo died, the planet began collapsing in on itself. The chain of command broke instantly, as every surviving officer tried to seize control at the same time, their overlapping orders turning the 3 major continental clusters into fields of confusion long before Leo even reached them. From that moment onward, the entire invasion became little more than a systematic cleanup, as Leo moved across the planet with the singular purpose eliminating soldiers and wasting nothing on unnecessary theatrics. He erased the first continental cluster in a few hours, moving through fortresses and armored lines as though he were dismantling a structure he had built himself. While the second cluster fell even faster, its battalions crushed under the weight of their own disarray while Leo carved through them with cold, deliberate efficiency. Lastly, the third cluster offered a brief attempt at combined resistance, with fleets gathering overhead and fortress cities activating every shield they possessed, yet none of it mattered once Leo broke their formation and severed their leadership in one sweep. Every region he stepped into was emptied. Every stronghold he struck, destroyed. And every soldier who he came against, killed. By the time 30 hours passed, Ilion Reach had no army left to speak of, as silence overtook the planet in a way that felt almost unnatural, like a world devoid of life, rather than a world with a once booming population. Drip, drip. Leo stood at the edge of the final cluster, blood drying slowly on his sleeves, as he opened the Emperor Suppression Manual and watched the numbers shift into place. Progress. 2,006,045,072 billionths. The manual confirmed as he finally let out a large breath of relief. Sigh. It's done, he mused, as he felt extremely relieved at the fact that he had completed the manual's insane requirement of claiming 2 billion lives in a timeline that still left room for him to save there. While also not having compromised on his morals of killing innocent civilians for no reason whatsoever. Meanwhile on Granada, Morris's POV. Thunder, rain, water trickled down Morris's bare chest, as he stared at the dark clouds over Granada with an almost aimless stare. Why must you die? He wondered, as for once there was no feral grin on his face, nor any mischief in his eyes. A mood like this was rare for him, painfully rare, for out of the 365 days in a year, he spent 364 in high spirits, laughing, killing, indulging in every sadistic pleasure he could get his hands on. Which was precisely why this quiet, hollow downturn that he was experiencing today felt strangely out of place. What happens after I kill you, Soren? He muttered, his voice low, almost contemplative, as though he were asking the clouds themselves instead of the man who had occupied his mind for 2,000 uninterrupted years. For centuries he had lived with a singular purpose, a singular thrill, a singular chase that spanned eras, as almost every night when he closed his eyes for a moment's rest. The same blistering thought echoed from his soul. A thought that said, I will kill you someday. And although he never realized it, it was this very promise that had kept him entertained and occupied. Through the rough times, the universe will definitely be an extremely boring place without the cult and Soren. I never realized it, but perhaps I need you more than I thought. Morris muttered, as now, with Soren's demise drawing closer, he felt a strange emptiness open within him. An emptiness that made him wonder as to what was next. What will I even do after that? He wondered softly, as lightning illuminated the faint crease on his brow, a crease no one would ever believe existed on the great deceiver's face unless they witnessed it themselves. Sighing deeply, Morris tried to picture the universe beyond Soren. Tried to summon the image of another rivalry. Tried to imagine any other hunt that could raise his pulse even half as much. But every imagined opponent felt dull, colorless, unbearably mundane. As compared to Soren, no one else stirred him quite the same. I would need a new source of entertainment, he whispered, the words slipping out with a strange mixture of honesty and boredom. And to be fair, the only one even mildly interesting enough after you, is your brother. He admitted, as his lips twitched faintly, though the smile that attempted to form carried no weight, for he knew that even Caliph was not as interesting to him as Soren. Ha! A long, unhurried sigh escaped him, lost instantly to the crashing waves below. Well, I suppose it is a problem for another day, he murmured at last, rolling his shoulders back as the familiar aura of careless amusement slowly bled back into his stance, washing away the crack of melancholy that had surfaced moments before. And problems meant for another day, he added, his tone drifting toward its usual playful sharpness, are meant to be handled another day, he said, as with that, the last trace of gloom vanished from his face, replaced by the unmistakable, dangerous smile that had terrorized the universe for millennia, a smile that promised storms, chaos, and whatever calamity he decided to create next. Chapter 831 Warm Regards. Deep Space, en route to the time-stilled world, Leo's POV. It wasn't until Leo was back inside the craft that he opened the Emperor Suppression Manual again, wanting to see what the gloomy book had to say about him completing yet another milestone. Shine. The pages lit with their signature purple ink again, reverting from the red hue used during the killing intent mission, as though the manual had finally gone back to its original temperament. Congratulations for completing 2 billion kills. Your killing intent has finally sharpened enough for you to progress to the next stage. The manual wrote, as Leo stared at the text without a flicker of emotion crossing his face. Having been burned by the book's dramatics more times than he could count, he knew better than to accept its congratulations at face value, which was why he kept a stoic expression and flipped to the next section. All conditions to proceed to monarchhood have been met. You may finally proceed to attempt the breakthrough. The manual encouraged, as Leo's face remained perfectly unchanged. I will now automatically unbind myself from your soul. However, before I do so, as per my creator's wish, I have 2 important messages to pass on to you. The page wrote, as Leo blinked in faint confusion at those words. It was normal for manuals to unbind once their completion reached 100%. But a creator's message at the end of the journey. That was something he had never heard of before. Esteemed warrior, if you are reading this, that means you have completed the Emperor Suppression Manual in its entirety. The text began, as Leo raised one eyebrow with mild curiosity. Since I am the one who created this method, I know very well just how difficult it must be for someone to master it to its conclusion. Which is why I must applaud your efforts. The manual wrote, as Leo's expression flattened immediately. Yeah, no, not falling for your pretty words. Nope. Timeless assassin, I don't trust you one bit. He said, keeping his voice monotone as he read on, refusing to let even a grain of praise seep into his head. My first request will be that you pass down this manual to someone worthy. Another warrior who will see it to its conclusion someday. For nothing would pain me more than not seeing my knowledge that I compiled with so much effort, not being passed down to brilliant young minds. The manual requested, as Leo's left eye twitched in annoyance. Narcissistic prick. Who do you think I am? Your servant, he muttered, baffled at how bossy the timeless assassin was even after being dead for over 2 millennia. Secondly, since you have shown potential by completing this manual, honorable warrior, please allow me to invite you onto the project I started during my lifetime but could never finish, as I lack the necessary vision to unlock its secrets. A meditation technique far superior to the Emperor Suppression Manual, which I call the Supreme Suppression Manual. The next lines revealed themselves, as Leo continued reading with tired suspicion. During my lifetime, I felt as though I never truly understood the laws of the universe to their absolute limits. And that if someone did decode their secrets, they could potentially become a warrior even greater than myself. However, this was easier said than done, as after spending centuries researching the perfect method to study the laws, I could only construct an imperfect and incomplete technique that needs to be finished by someone younger and more talented. At first, I tried to pass this mantle to my children, but having grown under my care, those 2 knew better than to pick up a project I could not finish myself. Ha 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 ha. The text glowed, as Leo felt both his eyes flicker in annoyance at the same time. The hell? How is this guy considered the greatest warrior of all time? He muttered, unable to believe how ridiculous the timeless assassin sounded. Regardless, although those two lack the spine to take up this challenge. I hope you, honorable warrior, will finish what I started. So to you, I leave the location of my half-completed research, in standard universal coordinates. 012.344555.777.992.423.876.654.990. Warm regards. J.E. The final lines displayed, as Leo scrambled to note everything down before the text faded from the book. Scribble. Scribble. Selfie shutter. Selfie shutter. He quickly snapped pictures of the page onto the data slate on his seat, only relaxing once the information was securely recorded. Idiotic prick, why would you ever write such long coordinates on a manual whose text faded away literally 10 seconds after it appears? Leo cursed, as he closed the Emperor Suppression Manual for the last and final time in his hands. Thud. Bloody hell. There is no way I am ever passing this manual to anyone I care about. This is a gift reserved strictly for my worst enemy. What kind of sadistic torture manual is this? He complained under his breath. And yet, despite all his curses, despite all the annoyance, despite all the suffering the manual had put him through, he could not deny the truth forming quietly in his chest. That despite the difficulty, he was immensely grateful for the technique in the end. For as cruel as it was, the Emperor Suppression Manual had been the perfect weapon to forge him into the warrior he needed to become. Well, alright, I guess I'll hang on to you until I find someone worthy enough to pass it down to. Leo muttered, as he stored the book away in his storage ring and looked out of the craft's window. So I can finally break through to Monarch, he mused, as he leaned back in his seat with a faint, steady breath, allowing the thought to settle warmly in his chest, as for the first time in days, he let himself relax ever so slightly before the next storm arrived. Chapter 832 Pride. Meanwhile, the pit, Helmuth's POV. Helmuth stood at the edge of a cliff overlooking the central basin of the pit, his arms folded calmly behind his back, his expression tightened into a deep frown as the metallic ring of hammers, chisels, and arcane tools echoed across the volcanic plains beneath him. Chick chick. Tap tap. Grind grind. Thrum thrum. The ground trembled every few seconds from the sheer density of power being poured into the earth, as teams of the righteous faction's greatest runesmiths, blacksmiths, engineers, wardmasters, and geomancers crawled across the landscape like ants, each working on one segment of the colossal Chakravia formation being carved into the planet's crust. Lines of silver, gold, and bloody red etchings spiraled outward in concentric circles, forming a labyrinth so dense and intricate that even gods who mastered the laws of the universe could not help but pause upon seeing it. It was a design they had only ever used once before. Back during the Great Betrayal, with the ultimate goal of the formation being to cut off the subject's access to the fourth dimension and forcibly tether her to the brutally restrictive confines of the three-dimensional world. Which meant that in simpler words, it was a fancy cage for gods. One where they could be reliably killed for good. Shameful. What Morris and Caliph want me to do is simply shameful. Helmuth mused, as the veins on his jaw tightened, the old pride in his heart stirring like an animal forced into a corner. For him, this was not how a true warrior fought, nor how a real god was meant to prove his absolute strength. For him, this was a disgrace, one that he wanted no part of, if the decision were left up to him alone. TCH, he said, as he clicked his tongue, his frown only deepening the longer he saw the construction progress. Only cowards fight like this. He began, his tone unbelievably arrogant and prideful. Cowards, women, eunuchs. Only they resort to cheap tricks like terrain advantages or ambushes to win battles. Not real men. Never real men, he muttered, as he shook his head from side to side in disappointment. Real men do not stand inside circles drawn by trembling mortals, nor do they lean on puny advantages or cowardly traps. Real men face their enemies in the open, chest to chest, fists to fists, soul to soul, with nothing but strength deciding the outcome. He said, as he clenched his fists in unrestrained anger, the urge to just disobey the alliance and destroy the construction site before him growing stronger in his chest. Morris and Caliph are both cowards. They might be gods, but they are not real men. They're powerful but they lack a spine. He admonished, as he vented his frustration about his counterparts, who were forcing him to let this construction go through on his sacred soil. The two of them had outvoted him 2-1 on this issue, and hence, despite his own disgust, he was forced to let the construction proceed, as the duo wanted every advantage they could get their hands on to take down Soren. However, unlike them, he did not feel good about this whole situation. As a man, for if it were up to him, he would crush all of this under his heel, grind the ritual circles into dust, send the runesmiths home, and stand alone in this basin, waiting for Soren with nothing but his fists and his rage to accompany him. If it were only up to him, he wanted to face Soren one-on-one, with neither tricks nor traps staining the ground between them, so that he could prove once and for all to the entire universe that he was always the better fighter. That the shame he carried for the last 2,200 years had been nothing but an ugly misunderstanding of fate. "It is unfortunate," Helmuth muttered, his voice low enough that only the wind carried it. "It is unfortunate that I will never be able to prove to you that I was the superior warrior," he said, as his eyes followed the lines of the formation stretching to the horizon, his chest burning not with hatred but with a bitter nostalgia that had existed inside him ever since that day of defeat so long ago. "For your sake, Soren," he murmured, "I sincerely hope you have found a way to break this Chakravia. I truly hope you can tear through its layers and make your way out of it without being bound, for only then can our battle remain pure," he said, as his gaze drifted beyond the workers below, and towards the silent sky where his thoughts wandered. "But if you cannot do that," he added slowly, "and if you find yourself trapped within the third dimension, then I will step into the center of the array myself, suppressing my own divinity, as I shall limit myself to the third dimension as well," he decided, as he refused to win through petty tricks. He refused to fight as Morris and Caliph wanted him to. As unlike them who would take a victory any way it came, he refused to claim a victory that would stain his warrior's pride. "No matter what Morris and Caliph demand of me, I will make our final battle fair," he concluded, as he let the sentence hang in the air for a long moment, his jaw tightening, his heartbeat steadying into something fierce and grounded. "I have lived with the shame of defeat for too long. But now I will prove to the universe that it is I, Helmuth, who was always the strongest," he said, as he first took one step back from the edge. Then another. Before then turning away from the construction site entirely, as he walked away without looking back even once, the anger simmering inside him growing sharper, heavier, hotter, with every passing step. Execution day was approaching fast, being less than 3 weeks away now, and Helmuth could not wait any longer to claim the title of the strongest in the universe. A title that he rightfully believed to be his own for the past 2,200 years. Chapter 833 War Preparations. The time-stilled world, Chaosbringer's office, Leo's POV. Nobody was happier about Leo's return to the stilled world as much as Chaosbringer, as the poor sob literally began to cry the moment Leo walked back into his office. "My lord, you're back. Your lowly servant was truly incomplete without you," Chaosbringer said, as Leo gave him a genuine smile, before taking a seat across his desk. "I hope you achieved everything you set out to achieve in the wider universe, my lord," Chaosbringer hoped, as Leo leaned back slightly in the chair and answered with a small nod. "I did," he said simply, as the quiet certainty in his tone spoke far louder than any lengthy explanation could have. "I am finally ready to ascend to monarch," he added, as Chaosbringer's breath hitched for a fraction of a second, his eyes widening with raw, unfiltered joy, while his shoulders trembled very slightly, as though he were fighting the urge to break into another round of tears right then and there. Leo watched that reaction for a brief moment, a faint warmth stirring in his chest, before he gently steered the conversation back to what actually needed to be done. "I am sure you are busy, so let me make this brief," he began, his tone turning calm and businesslike as he rested his forearms on the armrests. "I need you to acquire the Monarch Breakthrough Potion for me. The best you can get," he said, as his gaze locked onto Chaosbringer's, making it clear this was not something he intended to compromise on. "And I need you to arrange a suitable venue for the breakthrough," he continued, his voice steady as ever. "I will need absolute peace and quiet while I go through this process. So plan accordingly," he instructed, as the weight of those words settled heavily between them. "Rest assured, my lord, it will be done within 2 days," Chaosbringer said, his voice firm despite the lingering emotion in his eyes, as he placed a hand to his heart as if swearing a solemn oath. Meanwhile, somewhere in the outskirts of Skyshard City, rumble. Rumble. The ground quaked under the synchronized thunder of millions of boots, as Commander Mickey James stood atop the raised command platform with his arms folded behind his back, his expression drawn into a severe, unforgiving line while his soldiers moved across the valley floor with the precision of a sharpened blade. Thud, thud, thud. The battalions accelerated into position as signal horns echoed across the training grounds, their war cycle beginning with a formation that modern armies across hundreds of galaxies would have instantly recognized. Phalanx advance. Titan ranks. James ordered, his voice carried by mana amplifiers, as heavy infantry locked shields together in a seamless wall, the line stretching across the valley as they marched forward in perfect unison, their spears angling outward at staggered heights to create a deadly layered kill zone. Behind them, the 2nd and 3rd Legions stepped forward in harmony, their soldiers rotating positions every 30 paces to prevent exhaustion, as each soldier's movement matched the one beside him like mirror reflections. The classical phalanx was considered outdated by many armies in the wider universe, but not here, not under James, for he had enhanced it with mana boosters, anti-charge spikes, and coordinated mage support weaving micro-barriers between shield gaps. It was beautiful to watch. Terrifying to face. Yet Mickey James shook his head in disappointment. Too slow, he said, as a lieutenant stiffened beside him. Convertible formation. Execute the feigned retreat into hammer and anvil, he ordered while raising a hand, as the command horns blared once again. *222. In an instant, the phalanx dissolved backward, the frontline infantry peeling away with controlled disorder, their steps mimicking panic while the rear lines arced outward like wings. In such a situation, enemies unaware of the maneuver were likely to surge forward in pursuit, which was exactly the trap. The light infantry units, stationed on both flanks, surged forward at full speed as the phalanx's retreat opened a perfect funnel between the two wings, drawing the hypothetical enemy straight into the kill pocket. Heavy tanks from the right swept in as the hammer, while mage battalions and spearmen from the left compressed inward as the anvil. Rumble, rumble. The valley floor trembled as the two forces collided with precision, the entire maneuver unfolding with such perfect timing that even seasoned generals from the outer universe would have called it impossible. And still, Mickey James frowned. Reset. We run encirclement next, he commanded, as his soldiers obeyed instantly, reforming into loose, staggered lines. Canny maneuver. Double envelopment, James said, as the soldiers surged forward yet again. However, once again, despite them completing the move without a single mistake, James refused to look impressed, as he kept shaking his head in disappointment. Listen to me carefully, lads, he said, as he raised his hand to garner everyone's attention. You think this is enough because your maneuvers are flawless, because your timing matches the manuals, because your spears are straight and your shields aligned, he questioned, as his gaze sharpened. If you want to save the Dragon Bear, if you want to reclaim the cult lands we lost, if you want vengeance for the humiliation our ancestors suffered, his voice hardened further, then you must push faster, strike harder, move cleaner, react before the enemy even understands what they are seeing, he said, as he stepped toward the edge of the platform as millions of soldiers stood in rigid attention before him. You are better than the righteous faction, he declared. Your discipline is better, your formations are better, your spirit is far greater. But greatness means nothing if you are even 1 second too slow, he said as he put down his hand. Reset the field. We shall run all the maneuvers again until dinner. No breaks, he instructed, as, yes, Commander, came the collective response. Thrum, thrum, rumble. The ground vibrated beneath their renewed charge, dust spiraling into the darkening sky as the cult army threw themselves into the drills with a fervor that bordered on religious. And as Mickey James watched them confront fatigue, push past exhaustion, and execute the same brutal formations with even sharper precision than before, he felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. This army was absolutely ready for war. And faced with such discipline, no matter the enemy, they were gonna have a hard time pushing these men back. Chapter 834 Preparing the Ascension Site. Time-stilled world, Chaosbringer's POV. Almost as soon as Leo left his office, Chaosbringer redirected every ounce of his focus toward procuring a Monarch tier breakthrough potion, as unlike the Grandmaster and Transcendent variants that retained potency for months after brewing, the Monarch tier breakthrough potion remained viable for only 3 to 6 days, which meant that not a single ready-made vial existed anywhere in the market. With the ingredients required for the formulation being extraordinarily rare, and as the demand for such a potion surfacing only once every few decades, there were barely any potion masters across the wider universe who even bothered to learn how to brew one in the first place. However, thankfully for the cult, they had 2 such masters within their ranks who had not only learned the recipe but had perfected it over the years. Supreme Master, the Shadow Dragon is finally ready for a breakthrough. I will provide every ingredient you require, so please brew the finest potion you can for our Lord. Chaosbringer said, sending the same exact message to both potion masters while transferring 3 full sets of ingredients to each, which in truth represented the cult's entire stockpile of monarch-grade materials. If either of them failed, it would take the cult at least half a decade to replenish what was lost, which only served to highlight the staggering value of what he was placing in their hands. The Lord deserves nothing short of absolute perfection. Even if you succeed on your first attempt but feel the purity is even a fraction below what you aimed for, feel free to brew again and aim higher. Chaosbringer instructed, his tone leaving no room for hesitation, as he did not care if only 1 potion out of 6 survived and the rest ended up wasted. What mattered was that Leo received the best quality potion that could possibly be produced. And that was that. As for the breakthrough grounds, Chaosbringer chose a low plain surrounded by mountains on all 4 sides as the perfect venue, as the enclosed terrain naturally muffled sound and contained mana fluctuations, while also being far enough from Skyshard City that no wandering warrior would accidentally arrive at the location to disturb Leo at the wrong time. The plain itself brimmed with unusually thick ambient mana that drifted across the grass like invisible fog, while beneath the soil ran a corrupted mana vein that pulsed slowly with chaotic power, which although dangerous for ordinary warriors, created the perfect environment for Leo and his mana heart, as what was toxic to others was just nourishment for him. However, the only problem with the location was that it was this very vein that had turned the entire region into a breeding nest for tainted monsters, as grotesque beasts roamed freely across the valley floors, cliffsides and ravines, snarling and hissing through the shadows while tearing into each other with mindless savagery, turning the 40-mile radius around the plain into a festering battlefield of corrupted life. Naturally, such a place could not be left uncleansed. Not when Leo intended to stake his life on a flawless breakthrough. So Chaosbringer deployed 3 monarchs at once, sending Anderson Silva, Dupravel Nuna and Darnell Nuna to the plains without hesitation, as he instructed them to eradicate every last creature that called the corrupted soil home, and to cleanse a region wide enough that even a stray grasshopper monster would not disturb Leo. The moment the trio arrived at the location, the surrounding mountains began to tremble. Boom, 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 boom. Explosions rang across the plains, as the 3 cult monarchs unleashed all of their strongest wide-area attacks to first cut down monsters en masse, before then moving to the especially stronger ones that needed one-on-one attention. Growl. Snarl. The corrupted beasts lunged from every direction the moment they sensed new life entering the plains, their twisted limbs scraping against the cracked soil as dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of creatures poured out from ravines and shadowed ridges like a living tide. Anderson Silva stepped forward first, his greatsword resting against his shoulder, its edge humming faintly with condensed mana. Spread out. I will handle the front, he said calmly, before vanishing from sight with a single step, as a towering arc of silver light erupted across the valley. Asterisk whoosh. Crack. The ground split open in a long, perfect line as Anderson's blade carved a cleaving wave that bisected hundreds of monsters at once. Their bodies falling apart cleanly before they even understood what hit them. Limbs, claws and half-torsos collapsed in synchronized heaps while fresh waves of beasts continued to surge forward, leaping over their dead as though mindless of the carnage. Darnell Nuna, meanwhile, was already laughing heartily, sprinting across the battlefield as though he were racing the wind itself. Come on, you ugly things. Stop dying so fast, let me enjoy this, he said, weaving between lunging creatures with playful agility as 2 short swords spun in his hands, each swing releasing crackling bursts of explosive mana that detonated inside beast skulls and ribcages, turning every kill into a miniature eruption of flesh. Bang, bang, bang. Every strike he delivered shredded clusters of monsters in bursts of heat and light, his trail resembling a line of timed explosions marching across the field. Compared to the chaos they created, Dupraval Nuna moved like a shadow that the corrupted beasts failed to register until it was already too late. He slid beneath the belly of a monarch tear-horned brute, two daggers slipping into its joints with clinical precision, as he severed its nerves and arteries before the creature could bite his head off. So long, he mused, before springing up and moving towards the next high-profile target. As unlike Anderson and Darnell who were on crowd control, he focused on particularly taking out the strong ones. The three monarchs advanced across the corrupt plains in a widening circle, each covering a different sector, as their individual combat styles weaved into a single, seamless purge. Within a couple hours, the closest valleys went silent. Within half a day, the ridgelines stopped trembling. And within a day, the entire 40-mile radius had been turned into a barren field of still corpses, smoking craters, and severed monster remains that no longer held even a flicker of life. As only after the last corrupted heartbeat faded did the three monarchs regroup at the center of the plain, giving Chaosbringer the message that the ascension ground had been prepared. Chapter 835 The Next Generation. Meanwhile on Ixtal, Soren's POV. Staying true to his promise, Soren re-invited Amanda and the children back to the stone castle a couple of days after their first meeting, as this time he went one step further than simple hospitality and decided to initiate little Caleb and young Myron into the very first foundations of what it meant to walk the path of a warrior, for although they were only 5 and 3 years old, he believed that lessons planted young had a way of taking root far deeper than anything learned later in life. The training ground was spacious and open, the stone floor polished smooth by centuries of footsteps, as sunlight filtered through the tall walls in warm streaks, while Soren placed a simple wooden table in front of the children, setting a bright red apple at its center. Both boys sat cross-legged on the floor, Caleb sitting upright like a tiny scholar while Myron leaned slightly to the side with one cheek puffed adorably, as though the seriousness of sitting still for more than 2 seconds already strained the limits of his patience. Today we learned something important, Soren said, his voice soft and steady as he knelt beside them, his presence warm enough to calm even the fidgety Myron who instantly straightened his back with a proud little grin. A warrior is not someone who swings wildly, nor someone who depends on strength alone. A warrior is someone who understands how a strike works, how force behaves, and how to use it correctly. Soren began, as Caleb nodded far too seriously for his age, his tiny hands folded in his lap, while Myron copied him an instant later but tilted his head so dramatically that he looked like a confused duckling. Soren smiled gently before placing 2 large blunt sticks in front of them. To begin, poke a hole through this apple using these, Soren said, as both boys grabbed a stick each with the excitement of children receiving their favorite toys. Caleb positioned himself with exaggerated determination, narrowing his eyes as though preparing for a world-ending mission, while Myron held the stick upside down and poked his own knee by mistake, flinching and letting out a tiny, ow, that made Soren stifle a laugh. Try, Soren encouraged, as Caleb struck the apple first, the stick bouncing harmlessly off the smooth skin, as he tried again and again with increasing confusion while the apple remained unbothered, as though mocking him with its shiny red surface. Myron followed a moment later, thumping the blunt stick against the apple with all the force his 3-year-old arms could muster, yet achieving nothing except pushing the fruit an inch across the table. After a dozen failed attempts on both sides, Caleb frowned and shook his head in defeat, while Myron simply placed his stick on top of the apple as though hoping that it would do something magical, while Soren nodded patiently. Good. You tried, he said as he withdrew the blunt sticks and placed 2 sharp pointed sticks before them. Now try again, he instructed, as Caleb immediately perked up, gripping the pointed stick with far too much enthusiasm, as he jabbed downward and pierced the apple's skin with a soft pop of triumph, his entire face lighting up brilliantly. I did it, Caleb said, showing Soren the stick as though it were some sacred treasure, while Soren nodded warmly. Myron jabbed next, missing twice, hitting the table once, then finally piercing the apple on the 4th try, as he instantly gasped in excitement as though he had just conquered a kingdom. See, look, Myron said, bouncing where he sat as he pointed wildly at the tiny hole. As Soren placed a gentle hand on his head and smiled. Well done, both of you, Soren said, before placing the last tool on the table, a pin-sized needle glinting softly in the light. Now use this, he instructed, as Caleb blinked in surprise, then picked the needle carefully and pressed it into the apple with minimal effort, the needle slicing through the skin like it was nothing. Myron mimicked him immediately, giggling happily when the needle sank in so effortlessly that he almost overbalanced in excitement. Soren watched them for a moment, seeing the pride in their small faces, before asking softly, of the 3 tools, which was the easiest to use? Both boys instantly held up the needle with the same naive confidence only children possessed, Caleb doing so with perfect posture while Myron held it slightly backward with the sharp end dangerously close to his cheek. As Soren corrected Myron's grip gently before continuing. That is correct, Soren said, folding his hands behind his back while his voice softened even more. When you grow up to become strong warriors, always remember this lesson. It is not important how much strength you apply behind your strike, nor how powerful your arms grow, but how small the area of impact is where your strength lands. The words were simple, soft, almost playful, yet they carried with them a wisdom that could guide a lifetime. My father taught me this lesson when I was 3 and my brother was 5. As back then he said, Soren, you do not need to be the strongest. Soren recounted as he walked toward a rack and fetched 2 small wooden daggers sized perfectly for the children's hands. You do not need to be the fastest. You do not need to be the most gifted. You only need to be technical. For what matters at the start is having the correct fundamentals. And everything begins with learning to strike correctly. He finished, as he placed the wooden daggers in their hands. Caleb held his weapon like a budding assassin, his expression serious, while Myron waved his in the air like an excited puppy trying to swat a butterfly. Ha! Hiya! Myron voiced, as Soren brought a small training dummy forward, barely taller than the boys, and tapped its chest. Even you, with the force of a child, can slice this dummy cleanly, Soren said, his voice gentle and encouraging, if you learn how to concentrate your entire strength onto one single point. He guided, as both children stared blankly, their expressions adorably clueless as they tried to make sense of the complex idea. Myron pouted in confusion while Caleb nodded despite clearly not understanding anything. Soren chuckled softly and continued anyway, as he knew full well that neither of them truly grasped the lesson today, yet he also knew that seeds planted in young minds had a way of resurfacing when needed, even years and years later. Which was the true purpose of this lesson today. As although he knew very well that neither Caleb nor Myron were going to follow the path of a proper warrior so early. However, this was a lesson to guide their fundamentals whenever they did begin. You may not understand now, Soren said, placing a reassuring hand on both of their shoulders as the boys leaned into him naturally, but one day, perhaps a decade from now, when you hold a real blade in your hands and face your first true challenge, you will remember a fragment of this conversation, or maybe even just the feeling of this moment, and it will guide you on the path ahead. He blessed, as Caleb smiled faintly, his young heart sensing the warmth in the words if not the meaning. While Myron looked up at Soren with wide, trusting eyes, then lifted his wooden dagger and whispered, I will poke the bad ones. Which immediately made Soren chuckle and ruffle his hair. Yes, Soren approved, one day you will. Chapter 836 Breakthrough 1. Meanwhile, within the time-stilled world, the Ascension site, Leo's POV. As promised, Chaosbringer delivered both the Breakthrough site and the Monarch tier potion within 48 hours of Leo requesting them, as Leo now stood quietly at the center of the cleared plain with the small glass vial resting in his hand, the faintly glowing liquid reflecting off his fingers while a relieved breath escaped from his chest. Sigh. He let the air slip out slowly, as a sense of gratitude washed through him, for he could not even imagine how troublesome his life would have become without Chaosbringer handling tedious matters like this. Running around for ingredients, negotiating with eccentric potion masters, arranging a secure breakthrough venue and coordinating countless small details were all tasks that Leo neither enjoyed nor had the patience for, as even imagining himself doing any of it made him feel tired. Thank you for everything you do for me, old friend. He muttered, as a cold breeze drifted past his ears, breaking the otherwise perfect silence of the plains around him. Transcendent to Monarch, he he murmured softly, his gaze lifting toward the ring of mountains encircling the plain, the final step in a mortal's journey toward immortality. He paused and let the truth settle, thinking about how monarchhood represented the absolute peak of what a mortal could reach as a warrior, for beyond that, the demigod and god realms no longer belonged to mortal stages. It is what my teachers at Rodova hoped I would become someday, he said, his voice calm, though a thread of nostalgia ran beneath it, as he recalled the lecture he had received back in Rodova, which explained the difference between a transcendent and a monarch-tier warrior. A transcendent carried a unified internal system where blood, nerves and mana circuits fused together to create a single life network that allowed power to flow through the body without obstruction. Yet even at the very limit of the realm, a transcendent remained bound to the mana stored within their body, unable to influence the ambient mana that drifted freely around them, whereas a monarch did not share those restrictions. At the monarch tier, every cell in one's body began to mutate, reshaping themselves into structures capable of storing far greater quantities of mana, as the internal reservoir grew so dense that it naturally extended its influence outward into the surrounding air, as it was this outward spread that formed a subtle link between the monarch's inner mana and the ambient mana in the world, allowing monarchs to nudge it, pull it and guide it however they pleased within limited range. That is why monarchs can fly, Leo whispered as he watched a faint line of dust roll across the ground, for they can push against the mana around them and lift themselves as easily as breathing, he said, as a faint spark of excitement stirred within him at the thought of being able to fly soon. Crack, crack, cracking his neck softly, Leo began to warm up his body, rolling his shoulders and stretching his arms in slow controlled arcs, as he prepared himself both mentally and physically for what awaited him. All right, let's do this, he murmured, lowering his gaze to the vial resting in his palm as the soft violet glow painted the contours of his face. Shine. For a moment he simply held it there, allowing himself to feel the quiet weight of everything it symbolized. One small bottle, yet priceless beyond measure, he said softly, his thumb gliding over the cool glass as he raised it toward his lips and tilted it slightly, watching the iridescent liquid ripple in the light. Pop! The cork slipped free with a soft sound, releasing with it a faint metallic scent that drifted through the air in a slow wave. Copper. Leo observed quietly as he inhaled again, his eyes narrowing in mild amusement at the familiar smell. This is going to hurt, he muttered, though a resigned smile touched his lips, for he understood that anything capable of forcing a mutation upon every cell in his body was never going to be gentle. And hence, without giving himself time to reconsider, he touched the vial to his lips and swallowed its contents in one massive swig. Gulp, gulp. The moment the potion slid across his tongue, a sharp metallic tang burst across his mouth, followed by a deep bitterness that tasted like crushed stone, scorched herbs and raw iron pulled fresh from a furnace. As he felt as though he were drinking condensed lightning. He exhaled, the lingering bitterness scraping its way down his throat as the final drop settled in his chest. Bloody hell, he cursed, as although the liquid tasted bad, its taste soon became the least of his worries, as its potent effects gave him bigger problems than bad breath. Thrum. A heavy tremor surged down his spine, as though something ancient had awakened in his veins, beating once like a second heart before erupting outward in a violent rush. Flume. Uncontrolled mana roared through him in wild waves, flooding his bloodstream with a heat so intense it felt as though fire itself had been poured into his bones. His muscles tightened, his nerves lit up, his breath hitched as the pressure expanded inside him, pushing against every fiber and every cell with an overwhelming force. Oh yeah, gets worse with every breakthrough, he said, as a low groan slipped past his teeth, not from panic but from the sheer pressure building inside him. The heat no longer felt like fire alone but like molten metal being poured into every joint, as it kept spreading within him until even the spaces between his cells seemed to stretch and strain. Clench. His jaw tightened as he inhaled through his nose, feeling the strange sensation of his own body shifting in ways it was never meant to. Without the potion's intervention. Ring. A faint ringing filled his ears, steady and rhythmic, as though the world itself had begun to pulse in time with his racing heartbeat. Good, keep going, he muttered, as the first true crackle of cellular mutation stirred beneath his skin, signaling that the climb toward the monarch tier had finally begun. Chapter 837 Breakthrough 2. Time-stilled world, the Ascension site, Leo's POV. The moment the first wave of mutation struck him, Leo felt his knees buckle as a molten rush tore through his muscles, spreading like wildfire through every nerve while the potion forced its way deeper into his cells. Thrum, thrum. A violent tremor ran through his body as the heat intensified, burning so fiercely that even his bones felt like they were splitting apart from within. "Ah, damn," he hissed, as he clenched his fists and steadied himself, for the pressure swelling inside him no longer felt natural, as though some unseen hand kept filling him with more mana than his flesh could ever hope to contain. The sensation grew worse by the second. His skin prickled, his lungs shuddered, his heartbeat roared like a drum of war. Then the mutation truly began. Crack, crack, crackle. A sharp, splitting sting shot through him as the very walls of his cells started swelling with condensed mana, expanding against their own limits while the potion forced them to reshape. "Fuck, that hurts," Leo muttered, his eyes twitching as every nerve inside him lit up again and again like bright white sparks. The mutation spread further, crawling through his bloodstream like liquid fire. And for a moment, Leo felt certain his body would tear itself apart from the inside. Thump, thump, thump. His aura exploded outward in a sudden surge. The earth beneath his feet trembled violently as his presence broke free of its previous limits, swelling with a force that rippled across the plains in a shockwave of pure pressure. Far beyond the mountains, even the distant citizens inside Skyshard City flinched as a queasy shiver rolled through their chests, the oppressive weight of Leo's unstable aura pressing against their senses despite being hundreds of kilometers away. "Too much, this is too much," Leo growled, as the internal pressure kept rising, threatening to rupture his mana channels altogether. "I need to start releasing it now," he realized, as without a second thought, he lowered his stance and let the first skill rip out of him. 1,000 phantom slashes. *fwoom. *fwoom. Dozens of afterimage blades erupted from his arms, shredding through the air and carving deep scars into the earth as the ground cracked beneath the force of each phantom strike. The pressure inside him dropped for barely a moment before rising again at double the speed. Again, Leo growled. Fade step. 1,000 phantom slashes. Storm flash traverse. His body blurred and vanished, reappearing several meters away as the impact of his reappearance sent a circular shockwave through the soil. Kill strike. Crack. A devastating arc of condensed mana split open the ground, carving a trench 10 meters long as the excess power burst free from his limbs. Enhance. He stepped once and the sky flashed. His movement so fast that he covered the distance of over 20 miles in under a single second. Sonic boom. The very air crackled as he moved faster than the speed of sound, shattering the sound barrier. However, the pressure within him still refused to drop. His aura spiraled out wildly, twisting upward like a cyclone as clouds overhead warped and stretched from the force radiating off him. His hands shook. His blood felt like boiling mercury, while his bones vibrated with each rising pulse. Keep going, he muttered, as he slammed both palms to the ground. Astral hook bind. Spectral chains erupted outward, latching onto empty air and ripping into the earth with such force that entire slabs of stone were torn. Upward. Crownfall. A compressed spike of mana left his hand in a hurry, before slamming into the ground with a thunderous impact as dust shot into the sky. Like an inverted geyser. Celestial veil. A translucent barrier flashed to life for a heartbeat before shattering instantly under the stress of the overflowing mana, as it dispersed the excess pressure outward in a wave that flattened grass for kilometers. Night's whisper. A soft ripple pulsed through the air, subtle yet sharp enough to slice through the distant ridge like a phantom's breath. Enhance. Parallel processing. He cycled them again and again, faster each time, layering skill after skill until the plains looked like a battlefield struck by a meteor storm. He did not stop. He could not stop. Because the mana kept swelling inside him. Because his body was still mutating. Because if he paused for even a second, he knew he would explode. From within, minutes bled into more minutes. And the minutes bled into half an hour of unbroken devastation. Boom, boom, boom. Crater after crater formed around him. Stone dust filled the air. Shockwaves rolled across the valley like waves crashing against the shore. His aura raged like a beast breaking free from its cage, each pulse stronger than the last as the mutation approached its peak. Leo remained standing at the center of the storm, drenched in sweat. Breath harsh yet steady, his eyes sharp despite the agony ripping through his insides. He endured. He pushed. He fought the surge with everything he had, as his entire body strained against the overwhelming force. How much longer? He groaned, complaining about how the pressure rising inside him felt endless. However, unfortunately for him, he was still only halfway through, with this pain bound to last at least half an hour more. Damn it, this is dragging on forever, he said, his breath rough and uneven as another pulse slammed through his veins, sharper and heavier than the one before it, as though the mutation wished to see exactly when he would finally break. The world tilted for a brief moment, his vision flashing white, yet he forced his stance steady again as the trembling ground shook under the weight of his aura. Fine, keep going, he whispered, a strained smile tugging at his lips despite the agony, for no matter how long the pressure continued to rise, he had no intention of slowing down now. Chapter 838 Breakthrough 3. Meanwhile, 40 kilometers away from the ascension site, Anderson Silva's POV. Boom, boom, tremble. The distant earth kept shaking in rhythmic pulses, each one rolling beneath Anderson Silva's boots like a buried heartbeat, as faint ripples of dust rose every time another surge of Leo's aura burst outward from the direction of the ascension site. Anderson stood atop a shattered ridge, his greatsword resting against his shoulder, as he kept watch over the corrupted plains within. Unblinking gaze. He refused to let a single creature draw even a step closer to the site, for Chaosbringer had been very clear in his instructions that Leo's breakthrough site required absolute protection. However, while he had come here confident in his strength, the truth was that the past 30 minutes had shaken him in ways he never expected. Thrum, thrum. A fresh wave of pressure rippled through the air, brushing across the mountains like a physical force, battering Anderson's senses despite the 40-kilometer distance between them. Roll. Sweat rolled down the side of his face, as his fingers tightened around the hilt of his sword. The Lord's aura, it is too strong, he thought, swallowing hard as the next pulse hit him, heavier than the last. It did not feel like the aura of a transcendent undergoing a breakthrough. It felt like the awakening roar of something ancient rising from the earth. Each surge pressed against his chest. Each pulse scraped against his lungs. Each wave forced him to instinctively brace his stance. Anderson was a monarch, a warrior who stood at the very peak of mortal strength. Yet even he found his knees threatening to buckle whenever Leo's aura expanded too violently. Tremble. Another quake rolled across the land. Small rocks tumbled down from the ridge, while the surrounding trees bent as though caught in a sudden storm. Huff. Anderson exhaled slowly, trying to stabilize his breathing. Unbelievable, he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible above the distant tremors. Lord Leo, how are you producing an aura like this without even fully stepping in the monarch tier? He questioned, as he wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. Groan. At this moment, a corrupted boar monster slowly approached him. But the moment another pulse of Leo's aura swept over the land, the beast's legs collapsed beneath it and it fell to the ground whimpering, too terrified to move. Even monsters corrupted by tainted mana cowered like afraid animals under Leo's aura, as Anderson looked toward the distant mountains once more, unable to hide the awe slowly creeping into his expression. Every pulse of Leo's aura pressed outward like a giant's invisible hand, crushing the air and shaking the world itself. The sky flickered each time it happened, while the clouds twisted and stretched as though reacting to something primal. Sand lifted. Stone vibrated. The very soil beneath Anderson shimmered with cracks that grew wider each time the pressure struck. This is not normal, this is not normal at all, he thought, feeling his heartbeat accelerate against his will, as he gulped in anticipation of just how strong the Lord was going to be in the future. Meanwhile, the ascension site, Leo's POV. For yet another half hour, despite the odds stacked against him, Leo continued to keep the surge of mana within him in check, as beating all expectations, he refused to break, refused to collapse, refused to let the mutation tear him apart before it finished reshaping him into something stronger. Thrum, thrum. The pulses inside him kept rising in force, each wave sharper than the last, as though the potion seemed to test the very edge of his will, pushing his nerves toward the breaking point while his muscles locked and trembled under the strain. His skin burned, his blood boiled, his breath scraped his throat with every inhale. Yet he endured. His aura rose again, swelling like a storm trapped inside a shrinking vessel, pressing outward in violent expanding rings that cracked the earth beneath his feet and sent fresh shockwaves crawling across the plains. Come on, he muttered, as his fingers curled into the trembling soil. Then it happened. Crack! A sudden snap echoed through his body, not from bone or muscle, but from deep inside the marrow where the mutation finally reached its peak. As for a single instant everything froze, as though the world held its breath with him. Then, boom! The pressure inside him detonated outward in one colossal surge as the excess mana exploded from his pores in a blinding pillar of violet light that shot into the sky, ripping open the clouds above the ascension site as the ground cratered beneath him. Mountains trembled. Distant monsters fled, while the air itself warped and bent under the sheer weight of his awakening presence. TRRRR. Asterisk. TRRRR. Asterisk. In Skyshard City, 400 kilometers away, thousands of civilians gasped and clutched their chests as a crushing wave of aura rolled over them, not violent enough to injure, but heavy enough to make their hearts skip. As for the first time in decades, full-blown panic gripped the streets. What's going on here? Are we under attack? A few citizens asked, looking confused, as within the crater, Leo stood unmoving. The mutation had finally reached its conclusion, as the boiling heat rising inside his body began to slowly fade in strength, the chaotic mana finally bubbling back down instead of out of his cells. Pant. He panted violently, as in a delightful turn of events, his veins felt clear, his body impossibly light, while his core pulsed with a depth he had never felt before. So this is Monarch, he whispered, as the words left him in a slow breath. For a while, he simply lay there exhausted on the ground, until a wave of foreign clarity swept through him, subtle yet profound, as the ambient mana around him brushed against his skin like something alive, waiting for his intent. Oh really? Is it really that easy once you reach this realm? He wondered, as he raised one foot slightly off the ground. And to his joy, mana gathered from the surroundings, responding to his will, as the air currents around him shifted and his body lifted off the ground without much effort. Ha ha ha. A small laugh slipped out of him, quiet yet genuine, as he hovered there in the twilight air of the stilled world, the realization settling deeper into his chest with every heartbeat. I did it, he whispered, as his gaze softened with relief, for 1,000 burdens suddenly felt lighter. Being able to float in the air was proof that he had crossed the final threshold of mortality. That he had in fact, finally become a monarch. Which marked yet another milestone in his journey to become the strongest in the universe. Chapter 839 Alert. Meanwhile, upon the floating island, Multharak's POV. Multharak in his soul form slowly opened his eyes, his deep slumber disturbed, as he felt Leo's breakthrough detonate across the time-stilled world despite being tens of thousands of kilometers away. A faint ripple brushed against the ancient halls around him. Barely a whisper, barely a flicker, yet strong enough to reach the floating island where he slept. Multharak rumbled softly, as his spectral eyelids rose a little more, the golden glow within them sharpening with interest. That presence, he murmured, as his consciousness drifted outward like a tide spreading across distant shores. In all his years alive and asleep, very few things had ever registered as a threat to his soul. The laughter of the timeless assassin, the cunning of Zonrock, the rage of Helmuth, but never a mere mortal. Never a nascent soul cultivator. Never someone who had only just touched the peak of human strength. Yet the tremor he felt now. It was different. He could sense the surge of mana rippling through the time-stilled world like the heartbeat of a newborn predator. Unstable in its infancy. Chaotic in its awakening. But deep, powerful, and undeniably real nonetheless. Interesting. Multharak mused, as he drew in the faint traces of the phenomenon through spiritual senses. A nascent soul. He whispered. No, that is too simple a title for whatever that aura was. He closed his eyes for a moment, replaying the sensation again. The pressure, the weight, the distant quake, the unfamiliar ambition blooming from the depths of Leo's core. None of these belonged to a normal nascent soul. Not even to the rare talented ones from ancient clans. This sensation reminds me of the young dragon overlords during their ascensions, Multharak said quietly, his voice tinged with something rare for him. Respect. He shifted slightly, his massive soul form stirring within the confines of the island. Red scales of pure essence shimmered faintly as he adjusted himself, feeling the last echo of Leo's aura fade into the stillness once more. How unusual, he murmured. For a mortal human cultivator to disturb my rest from so far away. His eyes narrowed with a quiet, predatory curiosity. A nascent soul's aura should never reach me. Not from such a distance. Not even if 100 of them ascended at once. He said, as his long ethereal tail curled around the stone platform beneath him. It's almost like I'm watching the timeless assassin's legend rise all over again. He concluded, as he recalled the period of history where the young and upcoming timeless assassin was a menace to all ancient beast gods including himself. The youngling's aura back then was far superior to anyone else at the same tier, as he shattered the conventions on what tier strength was meant to be like. And the Leo of now, was following on that same path. However, unlike the timeless assassin, who was purely human, he had a bit of dragon blood in him too, which made him a completely different warrior unlike any other. You're a special one, boy. I don't think your rivals quite understand what you're shaping up to become just yet. However, the moment they do, you will never live in peace anymore. Multharic said, as he couldn't help but recall the period in history where all the ancient beast gods hunted the timeless assassin like there was no tomorrow. However, back then, it was already too late. By the time they had understood his true potential, the timeless assassin had become too slippery for them to catch. As his hope now was that Leo hid his strength long enough to do the same. Meanwhile, Chaosbringer's paw, Skyshard City. Knock, knock. The doors to Chaosbringer's office swung open as one of his assistants rushed inside, her face pale and her breathing uneven. Seventh Elder. Seventh Elder, the city, the people have started feeling queasy under this pressure, she said, almost stumbling over her own words. Should we ask the monarchs to stop the Lord's ascension? If his aura grows any more unstable than it already is, we might start losing civilian lives by the thousands. She suggested, as Chaosbringer's hand froze over the documents he had been reviewing. His expression, normally ever so calm, hardened into something stone-cold and unrecognizable as the assistant swallowed nervously, her voice trembling even more as she continued. Seventh Elder, please understand. We just received calls from the Central Hospital. Several citizens who were already in critical condition have lost their lives. They could not endure the sudden spikes of pressure. This is dangerous, she said, as she tried to defend her stance, only for Chaosbringer to slowly rise from his chair in unbridled fury. I do not care, he said, each word leaving his lips like a blade drawn across stone, as he pointed a finger at the assistant in an ungentlemanly manner that was completely unlike himself. If 1,000 citizens die, if 1 billion do, or if even I do not survive this day, he leaned forward, his eyes burning with a loyalty so absolute that it bordered on madness. Nobody, and I mean nobody, will disturb the Lord's ascension. You get it, he threatened, as the assistant staggered back, her pulse audible in the silence, her knees trembling as though the mere weight of his stare crushed the courage out of her. She opened her mouth to apologize, to explain, to say anything at all. But then, *BZZT*BZZT. *BZZT*BZZT. The crystal communicator on Chaosbringer's desk began to vibrate, as he picked it up immediately. Yes, speak, he said, voice sharp with urgency, as on the other end, Dupravel Nuna's composed voice resonated through the crystal. It is a done deal. The Lord has ascended successfully, he conveyed, as for one moment Chaosbringer did not move. Then, a grin stretched across his face. A massive grin. A grin so wide that it became impossible to tell that moments ago he had been radiating enough anger to burn the building down. As his shoulders loosened, his eyes gleamed and his breath escaped in one relieved burst. Excellent, he whispered, his smile only growing as he turned toward the window overlooking the trembling city. The Lord has finally become a monarch. Chapter 840 Improvements. The Time-Stilled World, Leo's POV. For a while after ascending, Leo took his time introspecting the changes made to his body, as he allowed himself a few quiet breaths to truly feel the difference between the man he was an hour ago and the being he had now become, as the faint residual heat of the mutation still curled through his veins like embers refusing to die. He slowly raised his hand and turned it palm upward as mana gathered instinctively beneath his skin, not because he commanded it to move but because his newly evolved cells now possessed the natural capacity to hold far more power than before, as though every fiber of his being had been hollowed, reforged and expanded to rise far beyond the cramped limits of a transcendent. His circulation felt smoother than ever as energy glided through his circuits without the familiar resistance that once accompanied high-speed flows, while the newfound density inside each cell created a sense of internal depth that made his earlier body seem almost fragile by comparison, as though he had finally stepped into a form that matched the sheer weight of his intent. When he shifted his stance, the movement happened so effortlessly that even he paused for a moment, realizing how perfectly his mana distributed itself across muscles and joints without the usual half-second lag that once defined transcendent-level maneuvering, for the mutation had eliminated that barrier entirely and replaced it with instantaneous response, allowing him to move with a fluid precision he had never dreamed of. Crack! A soft ripple of strength traveled down his spine as he tightened his core slightly, the ground beneath his feet cracking from the subtle pressure alone, not because he intended to release power but because his enhanced physiology now possessed enough explosive potential that even mild adjustments radiated a force surpassing what he could previously unleash with full focus. Nice, my strength has improved 2 to 3-fold at the least. While there's no saying how much stronger I've become when I use enhance. Leo assessed, as he clenched and unclenched his fists multiple times while feeling the faint currents of mana swirl naturally toward him with every small movement, as though his very presence invited energy into his body rather than draining it away. This is unusual, at this rate I won't lose any stamina in battle unless I'm going at 80% or higher. And even for such high-level battles, my stamina will now last a lot longer than before. Leo realized, as he felt how his stamina now seemed immeasurable as the fatigue he expected to feel after so much destruction simply refused to appear, while the rate at which his body absorbed mana from the surroundings had increased to the point where each breath drew in enough energy to refill whatever little he spent, granting him an endurance that felt almost unfair compared to his previous realm. Yet of all the changes he sensed within himself, nothing struck him as deeply as the transformation in his aura, for the leakage that once poured from his body in relentless waves had now diminished to a quiet flow that he could finally suppress through willpower alone, a miracle that he had been desperately seeking for years as the instability once stripped him of something precious. Inhale. He inhaled slowly and felt the aura rise within him like a tide, calm yet powerful, no longer clawing at his skin or tearing outward without warning, as he pressed it gently back into himself with only a thought, discovering to his shock that it obeyed. Not perfectly, but enough that it no longer threatened the lives of normal humans whenever he walked past them. The fluctuations that did escape him were faint and harmless now, no worse than a mild pressure in the air that most civilians would not even register unless they stood too close, as the realization made his chest tighten with a warm relief, for he could already imagine holding his wife again or lifting his children into his arms without fearing that an accidental pulse might harm them. All right. It seems like Amanda won't divorce me anytime soon. He murmured as he rolled his shoulders back and let a soft smile touch his lips, appreciating the quiet stillness in his core and the disciplined rhythm of his aura as it curled inside him like a tamed beast waiting for his command. Yet even with all these physical and aura changes settling into place, Leo could feel that the greatest shift of all rested not inside his muscles or bones but in the subtle way the world around him now acknowledged him. For the ambient mana drifting through the air no longer felt distant or indifferent but rather moving with a faint pull toward him, as though recognizing him as part of its natural stream. Tickle. It was this connection that granted him the quiet certainty that he could now influence the flow of mana outside his body with the same ease he directed the mana within, allowing possibilities such as effortless flight, the harmless shaping of flame, or the condensation of water from vapor to exist as simple extensions of his will rather than complex techniques requiring preparation or strain. He also sensed that this influence extended to the very air around him, as he could adjust its temperature as easily as shifting his stance, not through the use of spells but simply because the surrounding mana would respond to whatever balance he desired, making the world itself feel softer beneath his presence. Cool. Very cool. He assessed, as he felt impressed with what all a monarch could achieve without needing special spells. However, the most impressive of them all was definitely the ability to regulate his body's internal blood pressure. As wild transcendents could not regulate their blood pressure willingly, monarchs could, granting them the ability to fly into space and withstand its insane cold and pressure difference. As the only thing that restricted him from traveling between planets without a ship now, was the fact that he could not hold his breath for longer than 3 to 4 hours. And that he still needed oxygen to breathe periodically. However, apart from that, he was space-ready, which was a big milestone in itself. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.